and she has been on Coast to Coast multiple times. She's really a veritable wealth of occult knowledge, and it is just a huge pleasure for me to welcome Tracy Twyman. Tracy, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was very nice.
No problem. Yeah, thank you for taking the time to join me. It's been some time. I can see that you hadn't been doing interviews, and I was unaware until I read that you were the executive producer on a very popular show.
Yeah, actually, that's why I haven't been doing interviews. And I mean, that was accounts for a large chunk of the time that I've been off is for about 9 months or so. I was producing Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis. So that was an extremely time consuming thing. You know, I also have a 2-year-old son, so I wasn't getting much sleep, and I just ended up turning down interview requests. Unfortunately, I think I missed out on some good opportunities. But then I ended that job and started writing the new book, which we're going to talk about, and that also consumed a lot of my time, and just recently sort of came up for air, and I'm trying to tie it up and also pay attention to some other things I need to do, and you had contacted me wanting to do this interview, so it all worked out just perfectly, actually.
Yeah, it's funny how things just work out, but I'm very pleased that they worked the way they did. And if I can, I'd like to read the press release on this newest book.
Sure.
It's actually titled a little differently because it's, as the headline goes, it's American writers find alleged Templar artifacts relating to Baphomet hiding in plain sight at British Museum. So as the anniversary of October 13th, which has passed at this point, but in 1307, the mass arrest of the Knights Templar in France looms near. 2 American researchers, Tracy R. Twyman and Alexander Rivera, have announced that they have for the first time traced the real origin and meaning of the blasphemous idol that the Templars were accused of worshiping in secret ceremonies, the Baphomet. What's more, in the course of their investigation, they had an important Latin text translated that has been frequently referenced but rarely read by researchers on the subject for almost 200 years. In this text from 1818, Mysterium Baphometis Revelatum, the mystery of Baphomet revealed by Baron Joseph von Hammer-Purgstall, the author claimed to have discovered a number of idols and other artifacts of former Templar properties, the imagery of which allegedly sheds light on the heretical secret rites and beliefs of the Templars. If that interpretation is true, these would seem to have included child sacrifice and devil worship, along with wild orgies of pedophilia and bestiality. The translation of this text led to the discovery by our American authors just a couple months ago that 2 of the artifacts mentioned in Hammer-Purgstall's book, items long thought to have, by some writers, to be lost in history, but they have in fact been sitting unnoticed in the British Museum this entire time, hiding in plain sight. So I guess you've been working on this book for a while. The Templar artifacts of Hammer-Purgstall. It's Found Again is the article, and we're going to be looking for the rest of this book in November. But is it Baphomet: The Temple Mystery Unveiled?
That's correct. Oh, well, yeah, Baphomet's Secret of the Temple Unveiled. That's what we finally arrived at after several permutations of that. But that's the current title, yes.
Okay, so the new book is interesting to me because we're dealing with tracing back these artifacts that deal in Baphomet.
Right.
And I was more familiar with Eliphas Levi's work, but it seems, well, obviously he's this Hammer-Purgstall, von Hammer-Purgstall is where Eliphas Levi got a lot of his ideas.
That seems to be the case, although it seems that even he had his own interpretation of what he thought Hammer Purgstall was saying. So it's this game of telephone with all the authors of the 1800s writing about Baphomet, where they think they read what someone else wrote, and then they have their own interpretation, and maybe don't even remember exactly what they read, and then they write their own version. So anyway, it's interesting because I actually think that part of his inspiration for the way he drew the goat-headed figure is this picture in the Hammer Purgstall book of what looks like, if you're looking at maybe a low-res version of the picture, you might think, oh, this is the goat-headed figure, and he's kind of seated on top of an eagle. But it's only when you look at a really, high-resolution scan of the picture that was actually in Hammer Purgstall's book, you see that he doesn't have a goat head. He actually has a goose stretched over his head. It's just, there's a lot of bizarre pictures in this book. But yeah, what it comes down to is that this book is what has influenced all of the 19th century writers on this subject. And then in turn, everything that's been written about it afterwards, it was just sort of based on what they came up with. So I guess what I'm saying is a lot of the lore of Baphomet really came in the 19th century, and based on very little details actually about what the Templars may have confessed of, what they were supposedly involved in. So this whole thing about a figure with a goat head, I mean, that has that is connected, and it has a pedigree going back in the history of witchcraft and European mythology and things like that. But the Templars never specifically connected it, what they said that they were worshiping, which was a severed head, to a goat-headed figure. But it all does kind of come together when you read Hammer Purgstall's book, and then other thing. I mean, it's hard to even sum all this stuff up, because I mean, I just literally finished the text of the book today, editing, and I just have to do a bibliography now. But so it's like a very complicated book where we are going through, not just the history of this Baphomet idea, but everything that might have been based on in the past. So of course it goes, way back into ancient history and, Genesis in the Bible and things like that. But as far as what the Templars confessed to, they confessed to worshiping a head. And then a lot of other stuff was built on top of that. But there were reasons why all of these authors connected the stories of the Templars to this larger mythology. And that's what we've been tracing in this book. All these things are connected, but perhaps not in the way, that everyone assumes, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's so you've kind of traced. I mean, when you first get into this esoteric subject matter, you can find, all these similarities and all these rabbit holes that end up at the same place. So it seems kind of like you've traced this back, but you're revealing the parts of the telephone game, in a sense that where the translation has been lost.
And also, I found this to be very similar to my research into the Holy Grail, which I did over a decade ago. Baphomet, much like the Holy Grail, is a symbol with multiple facets and multiple forms, really. Like the Holy Grail was both a cup and a stone, and even a bloodline and a spiritual experience. And similar things can be said about Baphomet. And so Baphomet is the severed head. Baphomet is the chimera human with a goat head, and both male and female, just as Eliphas Levi depicted him. And he's also really an older concept, I feel, connected to this idea that it's what the original idea was, I think, of the serpent in Genesis. And you get a better picture of this when you look at the Zohar and some of the Kabbalistic writings. Is they talk about this idea that the serpent was a hermaphroditic being, and basically made up of these two demons called Samael and Lilith. Lilith the female, Samael the male, and the idea is that they were sort of the primordial chaos of the universe, that the universe was formed from. So this is what was there before the universe. And it's still sort of out there on the outer edges too. And it exists without actually existing. And this creature, this hermaphroditic being, the story is that God severed it so that the male and female halves were separate, and in the process castrated the male. And then they could not join together anymore. And so they're sort of always longing to be united with each other. And the only way they can do it is through what they call an intermediary named the Tananiver, which they connect to Azazel, which is a goat demon in the Bible. So, in fact, it's sort of the primordial goat demon. Azazel is kind of a name for Satan, just in the same way that the serpent is a name for Satan. But all these things are connected. These are like different parts of Satan, really,
Sure.
that all go together. And so you have this idea that there's a male and female half of the primordial serpent. They need the goat demon somehow to connect together. And that really represents, it's some sort of intermediary that allows them to have some semblance of sexual union. And the story is that they can only do it in a sort of semblance of actual sex. If they were ever to totally unite, if they were ever to somehow be able to unite again in a real way, it's that the universe would be destroyed. So the stakes are pretty high here. And the concept of Baphomet really is based on this, as we demonstrate in the book, very much connected to these primordial concepts that really show up over and over again in different permutations in different myths from throughout the world. So, this is just one aspect that we think the Templars may have been aware of, to some extent, and that may have figured into, what they conceived Baphomet being, and then, of course, later also what other people conceived of Baphomet as being. And I don't think that I think that you could define Baphomet as not just whatever, the Templars thought at the time, but also this larger concept that has really developed over time, both before the Templars and afterwards. We did, in fact, find the word or permutations of it, earlier versions of it. So it didn't exactly start with the Templars, but that particular pronunciation of it, it seems, did.
Yeah, it's we see so many different interpretations based on your perspective and based on where you're kind of coming from. I guess if you have a religious background or if you're coming at this from a more New Age perspective, and I think it goes across all writings and across all time. So it's fascinating to me, just the different angles that this can be approached, and there's the differences, but the similarities. That's what really interests me, because then we have to ask the question: Is this imagery, this lexicon, with this, these goat-headed demon figures and the snake, and it makes me wonder: is this something that's just inside our own consciousness? Is it some collective unconsciousness, or is it indicative of some sort of real spirit realm?
Well, I have a little bit of personal experience with this. I tried to, remove that as much as possible when writing this book, because I didn't want it to be, about me and my personal introspective thoughts, But the truth is that I've sort of became obsessed with this subject because of my own encounter with someone identifying himself as Baphomet on a Ouija board. And the book that I wrote before last year was all about that. It was called Clock Shavings. And it was just a memoir all about my experiences talking to Baphomet, because I started off trying to talk to him, a different spirit. I was trying to talk to a dead French artist, really, Jean Cocteau, and then it ended up escalating. I ended up getting referred to other spirits until I ended up talking to Baphomet. I was told Baphomet wanted to talk to me, and I ended up having several conversations with that spirit over a period of many years, where I learned quite a lot. I ended up, to me, it was useful because I got a lot of ideas about where to take my research. And while not everything that the spirit told me on the board, was verifiable or useful, a lot of it was. And it was kind of freakish. It was things that I wouldn't have known otherwise and things I couldn't have thought up on my own. So I found it a really useful research tool. And it felt like I learned a lot about Baphomet as a concept then, and even sort of felt, like I knew this spirit personally. And, I felt like I wanted to know more about the history of it and how it developed. So I really have been writing this book for about 7 years. I would say, about 7 or 8 years ago, I really started in earnest trying to write this book. And it was so big, such a big such a big subject. I had to get help, So that was why last year I got Alexander Rivera to help me. He's a expert on Gnosticism, and that figures a lot into this subject. But as far as whether I think it's just an abstract concept or not, I mean, the fact that I did speak to these spirits, and I felt pretty convinced that they exist on some level. They're independent intelligences. I guess that gives me a different perspective in a way. Like I can, for example, I can speculate in my own mind about how the Templars may have interacted with this spirit and what it may have taught them, and how I know from personal experience, actually, how spirits can even give you very specific information about how to do rituals and how to do meditation and how to do certain things to, achieve spiritual results. So it's not strange to me at all to think that the Templars might have done this, which is exactly what they describe. They say that this head that they were worshiping in their secret rituals it gave them what they call wisdom and enabled them to become very wealthy. So, this is sort of a something that I think a lot of authors on the subject have glossed over. And actually, there haven't been a lot of authors on the subject, really. I mean, because I don't think there's been another book really like this that was written specifically about the subject of Baphomet. But, no one has really taken it seriously, I guess, when the Templars said that they got their wisdom from this entity, and that's how they learned how to build a multinational banking empire, for instance. They built the first checking system and the first international banking system. I think they, may very well have gotten an idea like that from a spirit, because I can see how it would happen. I've experienced it. So I guess maybe someone who hasn't had that experience wouldn't have speculated that way. But, to me, it's almost obvious.
And I feel like it ties in with alchemy. You've got this, the idea of coming up with gold out of these lesser metals, or, of course, you have the spiritual sense of alchemy, but this seems to be more the monetary form of creating something where there was nothing before and leveraging it in that system. So
that is exactly it. That's the kind of international banking system they did invent, really, and that's what everything that has been created since then along those lines is an even better example of. That's what a couple of my books were about too, is how the monetary system and the banking system functions along the same lines as alchemy, and I even demonstrated how a lot of the people who've contributed important ideas to the development of economics in the current monetary system, a lot of those people actually were alchemists. So I wrote about that in Solomon's Treasure and Money Grows on the Tree of Knowledge, and it really goes back to the Templars. I think the ideas that they developed really have influenced everyone else who helped to develop the monetary system since then.
Yeah, and it just makes me wonder, as far as these entities, and these different manifestations that we see throughout history, which may seem unconnected and may call themselves by different names, but the very nature of these spirits seems to be there's a trickster-like nature in it, and you see, I don't know, the work of yours that I've read, where I'm able to really see this concept, uh, where if you're going at it from a very uh, left-brained scientific, if you're looking for these connections in that realm, you're not necessarily going to find it. But when you start to look at these connections through different cults and different esoteric and initiatory groups, we see these similarities, and yeah, it's very unnerving.
Well, you mentioned alchemy, and a lot of authors actually have directly connected Baphomet with the concept of alchemy, in particular the idea of the universal agent. So Albert Pike wrote about this. He was really basing his stuff on Eliphas Levi, and there have been some others connecting Baphomet to the idea that he is what they call in alchemy the universal agent, the one that's able to transform anything into anything else. So in alchemical texts, that's usually represented as metals being transmuted, but really it's the more general idea that you have in ritual magic of just being able to transform any substance or any situation in whatever way you desire. So Eliphas Levi and Albert Pike wrote about this as they called it a sort of a plastic, I don't know, morphic feel. I don't know. It's like something that sort of pervades all of existence that you can project your will into and transform it. Basically get a mold made of whatever it is you just projected through the plastic mediator. So that was one way they had of describing it. But they definitely use the terms universal agent in direct connection to Baphomet, from both of those writers. And then what you find when you connect Baphomet to the other character that's usually identified with the universal agent in alchemy, which is Mercury, they call him the philosophic Mercury. You can see that these things are totally connected. For instance, in Eliphas Levi's depiction of Baphomet, where he's sitting on the throne with the goat head, he has the caduceus, which is Mercury's wand, positioned right there where his crotch should be, and obviously representing that magical transformative power. And in fact, when you look at the way Eliphas Levi has depicted Baphomet, that's what he's doing. He's sort of this embodiment of all opposites in the universe being transcended and transmuted and crushed into one all at once. So, he's male and female, and he's a beast and a human, and he's got angelic wings also. And, he's both the waxing and waning moon. He's got both of those symbols on his sides, and he's pointing up to the heavens and down to hell. So he's representing this union of opposites that all the alchemists have always described the universal agent as being, that you need this thing that is somehow everything all at once in order to transmute anything. But once you have that power, you can transmute anything into anything, is the idea. And that's what they're saying Baphomet is. So these are all ideas that it seems like were projected onto the idea by occultists, in the 19th century onwards. But we can see how it all developed, and it's quite possible that the Templars had their own sort of similar conception of it. And that's what we spent a lot of the time doing, was trying to figure out this stuff. What would the Templars have thought if, with the level of knowledge that was available at the time that they were at, and the type of people that they were, and the places in the world that they were at the time. How much of this sort of esoteric information would they have been aware of, and would they have been able to conceive of Baphomet as being, as embodying these ideas or not? And in fact, it seems that Hammer Purgstall's theory about the Templars being influenced by Gnosticism, we did see, the possibility of that for sure. And definitely even Pope Pius IX thought that. He executed a very lengthy bull on this subject where he, basically said that they were not only Gnostics, but also ritual magicians in a way, and that they wanted to take over the world. They wanted to get rich and then take over the world, and they were trying to use these powers that they felt that they had developed from dabbling in these weird cults, basically, to they were going to use these powers to take over the world somehow. It's basically the same idea as the universal agent, which I believe Albert Pike said at one point that if you had the power of the universal agent, you could completely transform the governments of the world. You could, transform anything in the universe, basically. And that's what both Albert Pike, Pope Pius IX, Eliphas Levi, and several other authors on the subject have suggested the Templars were trying to do.
I also see from the article that you've written this idea of kind of warring factions and almost, I guess, blackmail.
Well, are you talking about the possibility that? Well, you're talking about the idea that the Templars were involved in orgies involving what would have definitely at that time been unlawful sexual behavior, like homosexuality, pedophilia, having sex with animals. We wrote about that because that's what is depicted quite a bit on these monuments that we talked about, that Hammer Purgstall writes about. He totally thinks, or thought at the time, that this is the kind of thing that the Templars were engaged in. And the origin of that really goes back to the same kinds of things that the Gnostics were accused of doing, by the church fathers who wrote about them. And we couldn't really find anything to necessarily debunk those accusations. In fact, we found sort of the origin of these kinds of rituals that the Gnostics might have been doing, and the meaning of it. We spent a great deal of time in the book sort of expounding upon that, that they were doing these rituals of, extreme sex acts, and why they might have been doing it, what they thought they were doing. So there's several layers here. And first we'll address what you were talking about, which is the blackmail. This is something that Hammer Purgstall writes about. He says that, the Templars may very well have, when they participated in these rites, kept tabs on who was involved so that they wouldn't rat each other out, basically. In fact, this is one of the accusations against the Templars. This is one of the things they were directly prosecuted for. One of the things that they were actually arrested for is murdering people of their own order that didn't participate in the orgies or that talked about it afterwards. And so the idea is that once you once you participate in one of these, you can't talk about it because you've done it yourself. Everyone has dirt on everyone else who was involved, mutually assured destruction. And so this guy writing in the early 1900s, Hammer Purgstall, was theorizing that there may have been some political value in the Templars making their members participate in these rites, because not only would they be quiet about the rites themselves, but anything else that the order wanted them to be quiet about. And interestingly, this is nothing. This is something that continues to happen because we still hear stories about politicians being involved in sex parties that kids and even animals sometimes are involved with. Usually orphans taken from orphanages and prostituted to the rich and powerful. And what you find over and over again is that these episodes are being videotaped, and quite often it appears that people who may want to come clean about what they've been involved in become intimidated, or they end up dead. And basically, again, the same sort of thing is happening today. Politicians are involved in orgies involving children, and then they can't talk about it because they've all been involved in it, and they can't talk about anything else that anything else bad that other people in the same group have been involved in. So that's part of what may have been going on there. And then the other idea, and these two are not exclusive, but operating at the same time. The rituals were basically ways of offending God, and the purpose really is, and not just God, but nature and the world that you're in, because the idea really is that if the Templars were influenced by Gnosticism, they would have been influenced by this idea that there's the God that created this world, the demiurge as they called him, and then another God beyond that created everything, including the chaos that we were describing earlier. So it's generally the idea that the world that we're in was created by someone who at the very best is sort of controlling and manipulative, and at worst is totally evil and using us and enslaving us. And yeah, the idea is basically that we're in a smaller version of reality, and there's a larger reality somewhere beyond this, but we're being kept imprisoned by this evil demiurge. So a lot of the Gnostics identified that God as the God of the Bible. And some of them believed in Jesus and thought that Jesus had been sent sort of as a spirit to release us from that prison. Then others weren't Christian at all and were against Christianity. So it's a broad category of people that, different types of people the Gnostics were. But it seems that, that this specifically the Ophite brand, which is a very snake-oriented aspect of Gnosticism, a sect of Gnosticism, where they make heroes out of Cain and Judas and a lot of the villains in the Bible, because the idea is that the God of the Bible is really the bad God. And what's interesting, we found in the course of researching the subject Baphomet, is it's the realization, not necessarily new, but definitely needs to be brought out into the air again, which is that this is the origin of what we call Satanism now. But it started out being something kind of different, because Satanism today generally is people embracing the evil, element of the universe and embracing materiality, but sort of giving the finger to the God of the Bible and embracing the devil, whatever they think the devil is. But initially the Gnostics were saying that the God of the Bible is the devil, and he's the devil because he's keeping you in the trap of matter, and they did not embrace materiality. But what they did sometimes, and this is getting back to the orgies, some of these guys would do these rituals, sort of to turn back the flow of the universe in a way, which they kind of represented as the Jordan River in their iconography. So the idea is that if the general course of nature is for spirit essence, I guess, to flow out from the outside and into our world and incarnate in human bodies through sexual activity, then they would reverse that flow somehow by engaging in sexual activity that did not result in procreation, or where the end result, the fruit, would be killed somehow and sent back. And there's many different permutations of this. We examined several different rituals and what they might have meant. But this is the general idea, is that somehow turning everything back. And what that turned into in Satanism, as that developed later in Europe, is the idea of reversing the Catholic Mass and reversing Judeo-Christian values. and specifically, yeah, developed into the Black Mass, which is very similar to what the Templars were accused of doing. Their rituals to Baphomet supposedly involved kissing a goat's behind or kissing the butt of one of the other members there, and and then you have this imagery of the goat that got kind of attached to that. Well, this matches up exactly to what people said that renegade priests would do in the Black Mass, and it also matches up exactly to what witches in Europe were accused of doing at their sabbats.
Yeah, I was thinking about back on the article and these coffers in the British Museum, because on the different sides they're depicting these things, and there was an alligator on one. You had these different scenes of you had children involved and animals, and it was it's very bizarre.
Yeah, I had someone criticize, and they of course they've only read the article so far. They haven't read the book, but they're saying, "Oh, these guys don't look like Templars because they don't have beards or something." Well, I don't know if they're Templars or not, but these are items that are connected to the Templars according to some author who is historically significant, and they do just so happen to depict these things that have been associated now in in the lore of the Templars. With the rituals they were supposedly doing. They look like demons to me, actually. They look like kind of squat, fat, little demonic figures. Do you know what I'm talking about? These little guys on the monuments?
Yeah, the men, they're very squatty, and their posture is poor.
They look like gargoyles, kind of.
Yeah, most definitely. And they really did seem to match up with some of the images from Hammer Purgstall's work.
Oh, it's definitely this. This is where he got it, or this is one of the objects he was talking about, and he has line drawings of the items he's talking about in his book. And so, what people have been theorizing about for the last 200 years is whether the objects, corresponding to the drawings exist or not. Which actually, for a while after his book came out, people did know, and I just sort of forgot over time. But I've only found one or two. I only found two of the artifacts, so there's a bunch more that I haven't found. And then the other question, of course, is, are the artifacts themselves real, or are they forged antiquities? Because, even back then, people knew how to do that stuff, but I'm sure they couldn't have anticipated the types of scientific dating processes that we have now. So I'm not in any way, by the way, putting forward these monuments as necessarily being Templar. I don't know. I just stumbled across them finally, and so now we can actually look into this matter. I think the museum itself has already labeled one of the caskets as quote fake, but I have not gotten any feedback from them. I wrote to them. I mean, I've talked to them about licensing, and I even, I was actually paid them to photograph several sides of one of these caskets that they hadn't photographed yet. So,
and they were, how cooperative were they with that?
Oh, fine. No, you just pay them a fee and they'll do it. There's a button on the website where you,
Wow.
if you want better photography, then pay us and we'll do it for you. So that was easy. And licensing we're still working on that. It's tremendously expensive. $3,000 they want.
Oh.
But as far as when I wrote to them for just to kind of ask, what do you guys know about these items? Because I'd like to see how that matches up with what I've found out. And so far I haven't gotten an answer, but it may be coming, because it's every time I communicate with that department, it takes a long time to get a response. So maybe we'll find out more later. This is really just the beginning of the research on the Hammer Purgstall artifacts. And I expect that other authors are going to take this further than I have, especially if you happen to be in England, it's probably really easy for you. But, I just happen to have this little bit of information to contribute. I don't care at all if, these items are debunked as being invented in the 1800s. And that would be an interesting piece of history, because this is what people are wondering about. Some people have accused Purgstall, who, by the way, is you know, no crackpot. You know, was and still is a very well respected Orientalist scholar and has contributed a lot to what the West knew back then and knows now about the history of Islam and the history of all sorts of things that have happened in the Middle East and cultures over there. So, this guy is no loser, but his work was questioned at the time, and even more so now, because you've got a lot of cynical authors who it's basically just, I would say, fashionable now to act like we know that the Templars were innocent of their charges. And I don't think that's been established at all. But authors who think that way have said that they think Hammer Purgstall was involved in this conspiracy with the Duke de Blacas, who's the guy that actually had the casket that I'm talking about in the British Museum. He's the guy that owned that and some of the other artifacts that Hammer Purgstall used. He had them in his private collection. And some people have theorized that this guy was loyal to the legitimists. In other words, he was against the French Revolution and for the noble class and the aristocracy. And the theory goes that in order to try to make the Templars look bad and therefore make the Freemasons look bad and therefore make the French Revolution that the Freemasons had been involved in look bad, that Hammer Purgstall and Duke de Blacas actually colluded to invent these artifacts and then write a book about them. And I think that in itself is a bit far-fetched. I don't think that Hammer Purgstall would have been involved in something like that. That's not the impression I get from, reading his work. It doesn't seem political at all, his book. And some of the people that have accused him of that have inserted, or assumed that this book has some sort of political message to it. I don't see that at all. So I'm wondering if those guys ever actually read it, But basically, the theory is that this is some sort of vast right-wing conspiracy against the Templars who were innocent, and really it's against the Freemasons and the Revolution. I don't know if any of that has been established. I don't think the Templars were, quote, innocent at all, and we I think established that pretty well in the book. Whether they did some of the more egregious things they're accused of, I don't know. They weren't Christians, so we can start with there and then with that and move from there. But they were not Christians, they weren't what we would consider Christians, any normal person. But as far as what these artifacts are, I think that clearly Hammer Purgstall's work influenced all the authors of the 19th century and then everyone since then on the subject of Baphomet. So it's important to know what he was talking about and how he came in, where these artifacts came from. We need to know the context of that. And I think that will shed more light on how the concept of Baphomet developed, and also just, the history of the early 19th century, the politics going on at the time. I think all these are very interesting historical questions that, we're just now getting around to answering. And over the next year or two, we'll find out more, I think. But, this was just one aspect, really, of the book about Baphomet. So there's, hundreds of pages of other stuff that is really kind of unrelated to the artifacts. But we do keep coming back to it every now and then throughout the book. It's sort of a theme, running theme through the book. Not because we need those artifacts to be real in order for our various theories to be true, but just because it keeps, being part of the lore of Baphomet, and it keeps relating in one way or another to, the research we've done. So I think, you could take that aspect out of our book and you still have a pretty good book. But if you really want to understand what Hammer Purgstall was writing and what he was thinking at the time, all of our other research explains that pretty well.
So the original text that had not been translated into English at all. If is that correct?
That's right. It's in Latin because I guess a lot of scholars at that time would just write in Latin when they're writing scholarly papers. And this is actually just one essay in a collection of essays called Treasures of the Orient. So, yeah, it was just in Latin, and Google Books had scanned it in, but they didn't unfold the pages that have the pictures on it. So when you look at the Google Books, you'll see the pictures are all messed up.
Hmm.
So it was really cool that, I had a friend, Philip Gonzalez, who tracked down the book in, one of the few libraries that has it. And he got high resolution scans of all these images. And then he even helped me find the translator, who has to be anonymous because he's afraid, actually. The whole thing freaked him out a lot. And so he doesn't want to be known for having done this, but he did a really good job. I don't even know if anyone else really could have done it, because of not only his knowledge of Latin, but his sort of background knowledge of other related subjects, related to the topic. So we really lucked out getting the right translator. But it was hard on him. He suffered some health problems during this, and then he started having sort of supernatural encounters, which he attributed to the book, and working on it and looking at the images, which he said were really creepy. So, in fact, he had to have an assistant at the end because, his health had declined a lot, and so, he needed someone to do the typing for him. And even the assistant started seeing the ghosts and things. So at the end, they were like very anxious to be done with this project. Wow. And it was just weird, man. So I'm really glad we got it, because for a while there, I didn't even think they were going to finish the project. They were too scared. And
yeah,
they were just disturbed, I guess. I don't want to make them sound like, wussies or anything, but
were they aware of your communication with an entity calling itself Baphomet?
No. In fact, I don't think he's aware of anything about me. And I said he has some background knowledge, but honestly, he doesn't have any background knowledge about the occult. So it's kind of weird. Yeah, we weren't expecting him to make such a complaint, but in fact, this was what he experienced. So again, he said it was the images really that he felt were haunting him, that they were looking at them over and over again was bringing bad energies. So, I can see it when you look at some of these pictures, and I've only put a few of them online so far. We're going to publish the book. It's, the Hammer Purgstall book, the translation of it, as a separate book, because I'm going to do a bunch of commentary on it.
Wow.
And that'll come out maybe a month after the Baphomet book. So, the one written by me.
Yeah. Yeah, and that book being referenced in so many other occult tropes and writings, not having that available in such a long time. That's just huge. And I've got to ask, did your communication with Baphomet have anything to do with you jumping into this, or did you get any specific information that led you there? How is it that you got to the importance of this text?
Actually, it was just obvious from, when I sat down and decided I'm going to write a book about Baphomet. You only have to go so far in your research before you run into this and realize that you need to know what that book says. And so I've been wanting to have it translated for, most of that 7 years, and just, was finally determined to do it. And once I determined to do it, it came together really well. But truthfully, I haven't been talking to Baphomet, I don't think at all or much, in the last 9 months or so that I've been finishing the book. We've been working steadily on it, me and Alexander Rivera, for about the last 9 months or so, really intensely. And I haven't even had time to do any divination. I found, actually, surprisingly, that very little of my communications with Baphomet played in here. It's mostly just historical research.
Yeah.
So that's fine by me. I'm not, I'm not here to channel demons for the rest of my life, and that's not really, I'm a nonfiction writer, and I just channeled some demons for fun and for some inspiration for a few years, but that's not what I do, you know?
Sure. Um, yeah, and I guess going back, I mean, you've been interested in these kind of strange areas of history and esoteric concepts. Uh, well, since you were in your teens.
That's true. Yeah, I think I, read the Necronomicon. I got into H.P. Lovecraft, and I read the Necronomicon when I was, 13 or so. And I think I was more intrigued by the way my parents reacted to me having that book. And so that kind of kept me going, researching the occult a bit more. Eventually, maybe I was 15 or so, someone told me about the Freemasons and the symbols on the back of the dollar bill and how there's a big conspiracy to control the world. And I found that really intriguing. And so, I think that's when it started really, because probably a year or so later, I was working for the school paper. I was going to Portland Community College and working for the school paper. And I started writing conspiracy theory columns, but, a lot of it would figure into this secret society subject. And then around the time I was 17, I think I started Dagobert's Revenge, the book or the magazine. And so, at that point I was getting into all kinds of esoteric stuff and have been ever since, just getting into deeper and deeper into, the history and origins of Western occultism, I would say.
Yeah.
And, I think I've contributed a few things to the whole subject over the years.
Most
but it's
definitely.
been a wild ride,
Yeah, it's I mean, you've been doing this for a long time and very very focused at it, but I like that you're kind of going where the information takes you. You're not necessarily making something fit inside a box. So it's the way things seem to have unraveled just make it even more intriguing. I guess on the subject of Lovecraft, I know you've done a book that deals with the Sumerian lore and its connection, and maybe that being a derivative of some of his work.
It was just, sort of tracing what sounds like the origins of some of the words he uses in his stories. They match up very well with a lot of Sumerian gods and concepts. And what's strange is that very little was known about Sumeria at that time, if anything. I mean, it would have been very hard for him to, come into this information. So I think, when you're an author and a creative person, sometimes you just tap into things naturally. And I think that might have been what happened to him. He's claimed he never dabbled in the occult. I don't think there's any evidence that he did, but you don't have to do any rituals to be inspired. And I think that Lovecraft may have been inspired by, the reality of who the Sumerian gods were. And it translated into the short stories he wrote.
Yeah, it's certainly after the fact, some of these other, even Enochian magic. I was recently watching a 2009 version of the Dunwich Horror, and in the whole beginning, it's like just all of the lesser keys of Solomon, with the credits in the intro, and it's the way this stuff gets lumped all together, it can be really, really confusing.
Yeah. Well, but what's interesting though is it does get all lumped in together over time. And once you start researching the origins of things and then the connections between things do get lumped up together. And you find that things that you might have thought are totally unconnected are. And I guess that's why you're saying I let the information take me wherever it goes. I guess in a way I do that. I certainly don't ever have the idea that there's just one perspective on an issue, especially, something the occult related. There's never just one interpretation of a symbol, and I think that is what a lot of authors make the mistake on, because you find it over and over again. The author that thinks that they know what something means, and they dismiss everything that everyone else said, and even sometimes call them names, and and denigrate them, and say, no, I figured it out, and it's this one thing. And it's so annoying. It's almost never true. And what you find is that all of these things reflect on each other. Like with Baphomet, you find there's several different ways of interpreting the meaning of the name, according to different authors. No one, of course, knows for sure what the Templars thought. So, you've got the people that think it's a corruption of Muhammad. That's rare, or not very many people really believe that. But then there's all these other ones, including ways of breaking the name down so that it's a code, an acronym, basically, or it stands, certain parts of the word stand for Greek words or Latin words. Then there's, ways of interpreting it etymologically, like it's really, this or that word from this or that language. And, Greek and Arabic have been suggested for sure. And there's people who say it means Father Mithras. There's people that say it means father or abbot, that is, priest, I guess, of the temple of universal peace among men. But what you find actually is that all of these, but the most common thing is, okay, Hammer Purgstall said baptism of wisdom. There was someone before him that said that too. And so he got the idea from another author. But even that had been sort of suggested in the 1400s in the history of France. Something similar had been suggested in the history of France by Jules Michelet. So the connection between Baphomet and wisdom in particular seems to be well established. Another way is, you put it through a cipher, the Atbash cipher, and it comes out Sophia, which is the goddess of wisdom, or the female personification of wisdom.
Right.
The divine wisdom of God. Which is, that seems to be the concept that Baphomet gets connected to most often. And so that matches up. I mean, we see that Baphomet is in a way, the same as Hermes or Mercury, or he's sort of a more complex incarnation of Hermes. Hermes is like a part of him. And you see him basically as sort of an avatar of the same archetype or concept of, Thoth, Hermes, Nebo, the Babylonian god of writing, Oannes, who's this sort of fish-headed figure that it was said to have come out of the sea to teach people wisdom every day, to teach them the wisdom that had been lost in the flood. And similar attributions, by the way, have been made to Hermes, is that he, taught people the wisdom that was lost after the flood. So we see Baphomet in a way as that, he's this teacher of wisdom. And I think that the different interpretations of his name really confirm that you can look at it from all these different perspectives, but it keeps coming back to the idea of divine wisdom. And then this baptism of wisdom thing is very interesting too, because that goes directly back to the Hermetica, where in Corpus Hermeticum it says that God brought down this bowl from heaven full of mind or wisdom. And instead of giving wisdom to every human being, he said we would have to fight for it. And so we're all supposed to basically compete for access to this bowl. And then you make the bold choice whether you want to immerse yourself in the wisdom inside the bowl or not. Because Hermes is explaining to his disciple in this case that not everyone can handle it, basically. Immersing yourself in this divine wisdom, this hidden wisdom, this gnosis may tear you apart. But if you think you can do it and you think you can gain knowledge thereby of what, why you're here, how you came to exist, then go ahead and do it. Go ahead and immerse yourself in the wisdom. And that is what we think is the clean version of the ritual or the concept behind the baptism of wisdom, behind Baphomet's name. So we think that this baptism of wisdom was a Hermetic concept. The Gnostics, some of the Gnostic groups seem to have similar ideas, similar rituals. The Mandians definitely have a similar ritual. That this is a Gnostic group that reveres John the Baptist. They practice Baptist rites, and they basically their ritual. The word they have for it is almost the same. It's immersion in the divine wisdom. So it's the same. This is what we think a lot of Gnostic and Hermetic groups are practicing, something along those lines, some sort of baptism that will, somehow bring you to this hidden wisdom or divine wisdom. Now, we think that somewhere along the lines, people had different interpretations of what that meant. So you had just a simple baptism ritual and maybe sort of, an epiphany coming when you endure it, like Jesus had when he was baptized. Or, maybe there's darker versions of it. And so then, we also elaborate on different types of rituals that could have been conducted and, would match up with some of the rituals that the Templars were accused of performing, and also some of the darker Gnostic sects were accused of performing. And we explain how these rituals could have been interpreted as a baptism of wisdom and, somehow bringing a person to gnosis, even though the things that they were doing, were not nice by any means. So basically there's a good or benign baptism of wisdom and then a darker version.
Well, let's take a little break here. And when we get back, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the scene of the crime, so to speak, and get your take on some of the confusion and some of the madness that can ensue when breaching that line and going head first into this subject matter. Okay, we are back with your, I guess, initial few years researching this stuff. Were you mainly focusing on the Western mystical tradition, or did you have some influence in the Orient, so to speak?
Not that much, really. I mean, I've read some texts about, that stuff, but no, not as much. I mean, yeah, I mainly write about the Western tradition, but, even in this last book, there was stuff about Kundalini and Tantra and stuff like that. So it all comes together somehow. Yeah, I mean, I'm basically kind of an old school syncretist, really. I mean, and apparently I'm not even aware of this. Apparently some people in modern times think this is a stupid approach to history, and anthropology in particular, the anthropology of religion and mythology. But I don't think so at all. I think that it's perfectly valid to look for the connections between disparate cultures and myths, and think about how they may have been influenced by one by the other, or in some cases you can't really trace the direct connection historically. I think that there's many different ways that could happen, that the same story and characters with similar names could develop in cultures that haven't had any contact with each other. And this is just my personal speculation, but I know that you can channel. I know that you can get messages from beyond. So it makes perfect sense to me that some of the texts that we think of as myths that have been developed over time and history and been influenced by other things, maybe they are channeled, and that that explains why they are so similar to other things written at other times. So this is for instance, one of the approaches I guess I take. I don't really, I wouldn't say that I write a lot about that idea that some of the scriptures are channeled and therefore that's the way they are. So it doesn't go into my books, but it goes into my mind. I think about that a lot. I think, a lot of this, for instance, biblical criticism that's gone on over the years, trying to trace the origins of certain aspects of particular texts. I wonder, would the approach be different if you took for granted that, maybe it's literally true that these are inspired texts? So, yeah, I mean, I experienced it when I was channeling on the Ouija board with Baphomet, and before him, we also spent a lot of time talking to Cain, the character from the Bible who identified himself as really this ancient king from pre-Diluvian times. He told us stories that, you could have based a religion on them. They could have been their own scripture. And he was sort of retelling the story of the Garden of Eden and kind of the story of Atlantis at the same time. But his version of the story was different than any other version that's been put out there. And I think that this is what has happened. In fact, a lot of the ancient texts are upfront about this. I mean, they'll say in the text that, the person writing it was inspired. And I mean, we know that, this is how a lot of bardic poetry got composed. I mean, you could think of Homer's works as, being inspired. And I wouldn't, I wouldn't take that too lightly. I mean, they meant what they said back then. They actually would become inspired by a spirit, and they would tell a whole story, a lengthy epic story, and not necessarily the same way each time. But that's where I think a lot of this stuff comes from. And yeah, so my I guess you started off asking me if I write about, Eastern philosophies and religions and myths and stuff like that. And sure, it definitely it comes in every now and then. But generally, yeah, my approach has been very syncretistic because I think that's a legitimate approach. I still do.
I agree. And I guess it wasn't necessarily even so much your writing, I guess, as far as your personal philosophy and where you came to this. Um, it's, well, I was just now thinking about, we have all these different mystery traditions, but I guess thinking about it in kind of a Kabbalistic sense and applying that as an overlay over this idea of, I don't know, Dulcinea's 100th monkey and this kind of ether or this, I feel like you almost said it earlier, the morphogenetic field, um,
Yeah.
uh, which I think Marshall McClellan talked about. Um, Oddly enough, some friends of mine have a, uh, I guess it's a publishing company of sorts, SyncBook Radio, and there's a gentleman, Wally Sherald, who just interviewed Eric McClellan, and it's I don't know, it's almost like we have these conduits throughout history who tap into that ether and pull these ideas out of it, and it's we see it where we have multiple people at the same time pulling these seemingly original ideas that are also connected, even though there may be no correlation or relation to the person. So
Hmm.
it's and some of these people were really big movers and shakers.
Hmm.
Um, and I guess thinking about it along the same lines of when you were having your communication with Baphomet and it wanting you to do errands or things for them.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah. Well, go ahead.
it's it just opens up a lot a lot of possibilities and questions, and I mean, I do you feel like there's a chance that this spirit is not Baphomet? I mean,
I suppose.
we have no way of knowing, but it's. Uh, I guess I'm also thinking about this. Are you familiar with the God helmet?
No, I'm not. No, what's that?
There was a researcher who he created this device called the God helmet, and he through his research took a wide swath of people that were everything from atheist to Christian, Muslim, even some Satanists, and he was able to, by getting them to wear this, he was able to trigger the neurons in their brain. And I think it was something like 80% of the people had some sort of religious experience
Mm.
that they were tapped into. And they saw different things and had different experiences based on their own personal faith. But again, there are these similarities. And, thinking about the technology and the electricity, uh, almost, thinking about lightning, and then the correlation there with the Kabbalah and the lightning path, and then tying it right back into this potential entity. Um, what are your thoughts on that?
Now, is this related to the headline that came out a few days ago that said that magnets make people believe in God?
No, that's totally different. I wasn't aware of that.
Okay. Well, I didn't even read the whole article. I just made a joke about it, about ICP and their song
How did
"Miracles."
that? Yeah, how do they
But
work?
yeah, I think it was just that somehow they are able to influence the neurons in your brain and make you have experiences that make you feel like you're talking to God, or experience, or make influence your beliefs on God at the time that the magnets are being applied.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I wonder if there's any. There were no magnets in the God helmet. Is that how it
No,
worked?
I think it was directly there are electrodes that touched that part of the frontal cortex.
Okay.
Um, so it was more of a
But
direct firing there.
okay. Well, I mean, what I think is that, getting back to your question, was it Baphomet? I don't know. Because like you said, there's no way of knowing. It's like talking to someone through a screen, and you can't really see them, and you can't, he doesn't show you his ID, so there's no way of really verifying who he is per se, I guess. But he talked like Baphomet very much, and you can tell. I mean, and why I say that, I mean, he matched up with what I guess I now conceive of as being the personality of Baphomet. But even back then, I guess it seemed his personality came across as being, I don't know, yes, to go along with what I would have thought Baphomet was. Now, this interesting thing is it contrasted very much with how Cain expressed himself, even in the way that the planchette moved on the board. So it's definitely a particular personality. And what's interesting is, when I contact him again and again, sometimes years apart at a time, he's able to pick up on, and throw out little like catchphrases and things that he said before, that are very specific. So, it's either Baphomet or someone who certainly knows all the details of what we've talked about before. But so he has his own personality. But as far as what you're saying with the God helmet, it's interesting. Not only can people, have their brain played with in a certain way, and it makes them think that they're talking to God, but I think that a lot of these entities that people contact in various states, whether it's on a Ouija board or in a state of meditation or whatever, um, that isn't it interesting that how often the entity itself identifies itself as being God, or the creator of the universe. And I think that this really kind of accounts for how the idea of God and also the demiurge has morphed throughout time and in different cultures and different cults and sects. Because if you think about it, it's kind of like, Baphomet, the way it developed, especially post Levi in the modern Western occult world, he became kind of the demiurge. He became the one that is sort of in charge of the world of matter. And even in Freemasonry, they refer to the great architect of the universe. And I noticed years ago that they have this acronym, to stand for that phrase, the great architect of the universe. And of course, it spells out the word GAO2. It looks very similar to the word goat, which I noticed a long time ago. And then I read recently that actually it used to be goat. This is in Freemasonry for Dummies, that book, that it used to be goat. They had a different acronym, and it actually spelled out goat. So, eventually someone got offended by this because they felt the great architect of the universe is God and you shouldn't represent him as a goat. So they changed it. But there's still this idea that mostly written about by non-Masons, but the Masons themselves kind of embrace it. There's this idea that they, worship a goat at the lodge, and in fact that they, in an initiation, they do this ritual supposedly called riding the goat. Well, there's no real riding the goat ritual that we know of that we can prove, but it's this concept that has been written about so much that it kind of stands on its own. That, when you join the Freemasons, you learn to ride the goat. And what is the goat? The goat is the great architect of the universe.
Interesting. Yeah, I did some amount of research. And I actually found more of that ritual being directly related with the Independent Order of the Oddfellows. And them riding the goat, this wooden thing with wheels, and but that's also another quasi-Masonic order.
Yeah, they all did it, actually. And then there's even other weird spin-offs of Freemasonry that did it as well. So at that time, in sort of the late 19th century, early 20th, this goat riding joke kind of really took off. And so there were these companies that make Masonic supplies. They made the same supplies. They were the suppliers for all these different groups. So they probably had a different version of the goat, just a slightly different version of the mechanical goat that they manufactured for all the orders that participated in that same kind of ritual. And I think they do. I think at least back then maybe these things might have been used, perhaps not in a real solemn Masonic ritual, but in sort of the plays and games that would take place afterwards during all the drinking and carousing that sometimes happens afterwards.
Sure.
So I think the goat was sort of a joke, but it was embraced and it was used in rituals that were more jokes and hazing, but not necessarily a real Masonic ritual. But anyway, my point in bringing that up was simply to say that yes, it seems like a lot of Masons. Certainly Albert Pike, as we talked about, Albert, what's his name? Mackey, not Albert. Maybe it is Albert Mackey. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, Mackey, another Masonic writer, also seems to identify Baphomet as being basically the great architect of the universe, the demiurge. But they're viewing it in a positive light, not in the negative light that's some of the anti-creationist Gnostic groups saw it. So a lot of the Gnostics viewed the demiurge, the creator of this world, as being negative. The Hermeticists didn't seem to have that same kind of view. I mean, they felt like there was another reality beyond this, but not that this one was necessarily negative. So they had a more positive view of the demiurge. And then after Gnosticism, and after all these ideas sort of filtered and developed through the medieval era, you had Satanism develop and different witch cults and things like that in Europe. And so then the idea develops that the goat god who was really sort of a pagan. We talked about. I think we talked about Pan earlier. Maybe we didn't. I don't know. Is kind of similar to the idea that the Greeks had this god Pan, who was kind of a fertility god. That image of the goat as a fertility god kind of merged with this idea of a demiurge, and developed into this idea that Satan is the goat god and he's the lord of this earth, the prince of the world, as it says in the Bible. So then I think it developed into this idea. You have, of course, Satanists who are kind of almost antisocial, embracing the evil element of things. Then you have Western occultism that is often sort of Luciferian, that is, sympathetic to Lucifer or Satan, but not necessarily to the exclusion of God, right? Or
Right.
not in the same way that a Satanist would embrace Satan. And I think what happened is definitely with the Satanists, they kind of view Satan as being the god of this world and the one you would turn to achieve things in life. And if they sort of always embrace materiality and carnality, and they viewed the goat god as being their lord, the one to look up to. I'm not sure. The Freemason point of view is a little bit different, and that's what's really hard to pin down. And of course, I'm not saying that any individual Freemason actually thinks this. What I'm trying to do actually is tease out the meaning behind the rituals and the symbolism of Freemasonry. So I'm sure someone will write to me and say, I'm a Freemason and I don't believe that, and it's not a religion, and we don't have one belief.
Right.
True, but I mean, we're decoding symbols here, basically,
Right.
and to a certain extent, I think you can take, when you have Masonic authors like Mackey and Pike publishing things, especially when they go together, when they match up, that does sort of, become an official interpretation of a Masonic symbol. So, I think it would be foolish to dismiss Pike and Mackey and say that their opinion doesn't matter, or that they don't stand for, what Freemasons stand for. I mean, they kind of do. And so, I think that their description of this architect of the universe concept matching as being the same as Baphomet and the universal agent that can transform matter. All this stuff goes together, and it's really interesting then to try to think about, well, what do they think is the devil? In that conception, what does it mean? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure you can find nuances in their writings, sort of describing or alluding to that. But I mean, what it is basically is this idea that everything, in the end, everything sort of washes out, and there really is no good and evil once you look at reality from this higher perspective, the perspective of the demiurge and anyone above him. So, I guess their conception of the demiurge is something beyond good and evil.
Yeah, I can see it, in multiple ways. It's like on one level, that's a really convenient thing. If you're a really awful person, you're like, oh, it's a way of getting the guilt off of yourself in a way. But on another level, if you're looking at this concept of Lucifer as this bringer of light and knowledge, and knowledge of the self and knowledge of both good and evil, and the ability to transmute and transcend that.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like you have, like, again, these in the article you had, I forget exactly how you phrased it, but it was to the effect of these orders that were essentially bringing people in that had good intentions, and leading them down a giant rabbit hole. I don't know if you know what I'm talking
Well,
about.
I think that, yeah, there's the possibility that is going on, and strong possibility, really. I mean, I sort of felt that with my own encounter with the spirits I was talking to, that, you know, on the one hand, you can have what seems like a candid conversation with them for a while, and they'll answer your questions, but then, you know, they'll start to get coy and not give you a full answer, and then they begin to try to twist things and try to pull you into a particular interpretation of something. And what I found over and over again is they're trying to get you to worship them, and they're trying to get you to identify them somehow as being God. So Baphomet would tell us this creation story, his version of it, in which he's somehow involved in the creation of humanity and sort of a father or mother, really, of humanity. And that, you know, God was involved too, but he's not telling the truth about how it happened. So anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that it's interesting when people talk to either Baphomet or God or some other entity that either identifies itself as God or as the creator of this world. You know, you get so many different versions of the story, and that's why it's really hard to put these things together. Why, you know, my job as a syncretist is so hard, because you run into this thing where, yeah, a lot of these myths are telling the same stories, or at least a lot of the elements are the same. But one of the most fundamental aspects is the creator good or not? And who is the devil in opposition to him? They can't agree on that. In fact, they have polar opposite points of view on that. And even groups that seem to be influenced by, you know, an older group, the two groups won't have the same view on that fundamental question. And I think that a lot of this comes through the channeling process, and the fact that if you take what a spirit says at face value, you know, it feels like you're believing it. It's going to tell you that it's God, whatever that means to you. So if you're, you know, the type of person that thinks of God as the creator of the universe, then it's going to take credit for that. If you're the type of person that sort of rejects materiality and is looking for some other truth beyond the world that we're in, well, they'll tell you that, you know, the creator of this world is evil and I'm something beyond that. I'm something better. And I don't know if hopefully there is something better, you know, hopefully there's some truth out there, because the experience of doing this personally, the experience of channeling spirits like this, plus then, you know, doing the cross comparison as I have of all these different scriptures and myths, kind of makes you feel cynical and scared about, you know, what, if any, truth there is about this stuff. You know, I don't know what I'm going to run into, I guess, when I die, you know, and I don't know if we as a species will ever get any kind of glimpse at what lies beyond this world. The only thing I can say for sure is, like, it seems like there is something, you know. I don't think at all that these spirits are just kind of projections of my mind, or that I'm imagining this at all, or that any of the other people who've claimed to have contacted them are lying or imagining it. I think that there's definitely something beyond, but you know, there's a veil and we cannot see it, and we don't know if they're lying or not about any of it. So it's scary, I think, you know.
Yeah, and there's one thing that all of these different faiths uh, share, and that's that this one, or this concept of God, can't fully be known or realized. We're not capable of really knowing. And
Hmm.
in a very abstract sense, you have this concept of the tesseract, and yeah, being in this third dimensional reality. We're on the precipice of this intersection between the hardest science with the particle collider, and then looking for these states of matter that are closest to what the conditions were at the time of the Big Bang. And, you know, if we envision this fourth dimensional realm, that we can't really fully grasp in our 3D realm. This concept of there being these different archetypal forces that are part of this fourth dimensional realm, and it's trying to not get too off point here, but when we're in these transcendental realms, and through meditation or these different altered states of consciousness, if we're on some level tapping into that spirit realm, and there's this, we can't really fully understand that dimension, but if we are aware of that fact, and I guess hesitant and taking whatever comes through with a grain of salt, being able to compare these different possibilities, I guess that's all we can really do. But it's, if you're having these entities having you do favors for them, it's that's the part that really I guess gives me the willies.
Well, it's interesting that it seems like what the favor they want most, and I'm not speaking only of myself and my own experience, but what it seems like they push other people to do, and I'm talking about spirits in general, spirits that inspire people to write, is they want to promote the idea of them, the belief in them. So it's almost like they need people to believe in them somehow, which I've sort of written about in the past, the idea, and you find it a lot in the Greek poets when they write about their gods. They talk about them as kind of being needy and dependent on the beliefs of the people, dependent on the sacrifices of their believers. And literally they sort of picture it as the gods need those sacrifices, they need that blood, and they need the belief. Without the belief, they won't exist. Without the blood, they'll die. And it's interesting because when you were talking about the CERN projects, right? At the particle collider in Switzerland, there it seems to me they just keep finding whatever they're looking for,
Right.
They reach down in there and then they pull something up, and lo and behold, it's exactly what they were looking for. And I just saw the headline today, but there was some other experiment. It's kind of building on the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It's another experiment proving that the atoms don't really, I think the headline said that they don't move while you're not looking at them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that.
Or while you are looking at them.
Right along with Schrodinger's cat.
Yes. And what I'm thinking is this all connects in some way, in that my conception of this chaos that they talk about that existed before existence, from the way it's described in so many myths and scriptures, it seems to me that this is a chaos of potentiality. Yeah. And this matches up, I think, with what they talk about in alchemy, where they talk about the prima materia, the primal material of the universe that you can, through alchemical processes, transform into whatever you want. So and the idea is like you take a piece of matter that you want to transmute, you break it down into the prima materia, which is this chaos that existed before creation, and then you reform it into whatever form you want. And I think this is the idea of potentiality, which again also kind of matches up with quantum physics in a way. They talk about potentials and how each atom, every time it moves, or even a little subatomic part of the atom, every time it does something, well, there's all these other possibilities that could have happened, and they even theorize, well, maybe there are these other universes created. Every time a particle spins one way, there's actually another universe where it's spun the other way, and all these subtle differences actually exist, that there's actually a different universe for all of these little differences created by the movement of the particles. And I think that this chaos can be conceived of as that. This is a place where all those other possibilities exist too, and you can reach into it and pull something out, potentially whatever you want at any given time. And interestingly, I theorize in a way that this is where, the gods and spirits are. And so they don't really exist unless we're encountering them or believing in them, that we're somehow bringing them into existence at every moment that we're interacting with them. And, this is a theory, of course, but I don't know, if there's any truth to it to be established ever, if you could ever prove such a thing. What I'm looking at it more from a mythological perspective of interpreting myths. And I think this is what the ancients kind of thought of it as. This is what they thought the chaos was. And, it will almost be blasphemous to say it outright. So they hint it in symbolically and in different ways. They kind of allude to it. This is what I think is going on. And I think you even see the same symbolism in a lot of fairy tales and novels and movies and all sorts of creations of fiction. You see the same idea of this ideal world that exists out there that's made up of potentiality and imagination, and it only exists when we interact with it. It's a recurring theme in a lot of fantasy stories and kids stories and things like that. Never Ending Story, for instance.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch, actually. So, this is kind of what I think I was interacting with during my Ouija sessions. And I think that accounts also for a lot of the variation in mythology and why people get different interpretations and different messages that kind of contradict the messages that other people have gotten. There's no real truth to it. It's constantly changing. It's mutable because it doesn't really exist.
Much like time, which, thinking about the title of your book, Clock Shavings. Have you had any thought on whether this Baphomet created time itself?
Well, I have thought about that, and honestly, I don't want to take Baphomet's words at face value, so I don't necessarily credit him with creating anything, although it's possible. But time definitely seems to be part of the prison we're in. It's an inextractable part. We're in the time-space world, and outside of this, I assume, I don't know, maybe time exists in some other way. But it's interesting when you look at the Garden of Eden and then other stories and other myths, other cultures' myths that are similar. These stories always seem like they are about a time before time. And part of the evidence of that is that they kind of, especially in the Bible for sure, in Genesis, it's very hard to determine the order of events. You may not think so, but once you read it and you realize that there's two different versions of the creation with totally different details of the creation of humans. And then you sort of, when you interpret it and realize that the flood itself is kind of the same story as the fall from Eden. It's just a different version, a different way of symbolizing the same idea. These things they're trying to express the creation of something from nothing. And so when you describe chaos as existing before creation, what does that really mean if creation involved the creation of time? And in fact, that is what this story of Adam and Eve seems to symbolize, because it's like when they eat the fruit, all of a sudden they gain carnal knowledge, right? And they're able to reproduce. They immediately start reproducing. And they realize they're naked and everything. It's obvious it has to do with sex, and Even the Zohar and all these rabbinical texts, all these Kabbalistic texts say that, in fact, they talk about this, the serpent impregnating Eve, and that Cain was the child of the serpent, and also that the serpent took the form of Lilith, the demoness, and had sex with Adam, and that they have demon hybrid children, all over the place. And basically, what was happening was that was the beginning of time. So it's the beginning of generation, birth and death. And before that, these things didn't really exist. Instead, Adam and Eve were in some kind of, I don't know, realm where all possibilities existed. I think you had the possibility of life, but it hadn't happened yet. You have the germ or the seed, and in fact, you see this same type of imagery in the story itself. They talk about the fruit that has the seed inside of it. The fruit that is the seed of the tree. It's like it has the seed of what will come. It has the male and the female aspects in it, but they male and female don't mean anything yet because they haven't separated yet. And in fact, that's what the first version of creation in Genesis says. It's the description of a hermaphroditic being that then is split apart. And then when they retell the story of creating Adam and Eve the second time, they don't have that aspect of the hermaphrodite, and they talk about taking a rib out of Adam and separately creating Eve. But certainly in this first version, you get this idea that the fall from the garden was really this splitting apart of this perfect potentiality of creation. It was perfect because it was potential, because it hadn't actually happened. So, and then it split apart. The male and female aspects split apart. The pod that they were in split apart, and they're thrown out into the cruel world. But that world itself didn't exist until that happened. All this stuff happens. The potentialities become reality when the egg splits apart, when the male and female split apart. But that's also the flaw, right? And that's when all the negative aspects of existence come also, So that's why it's the tree of good and evil, because it's the tree of, has the potentiality of all the wonderful things in life, including, birth and sex and all these wonderful things. But it's, also ends in death for everyone. And it's a life of hardship. And none of these things existed in the golden potential world that existed before. And so you have the same thing, in Greek mythology. They talk about the golden age, and that Saturn, who's their god of time, or, I guess it was Kronos to the Greeks, Saturn to the Romans. He was the king of the golden age, in which no one had to work, supposedly. Everything was perfect and wonderful, and, everything you need was just there hanging on the tree. People were eating fruits, basically, and not having to work is how they're describing it. And, and then the golden age ended, and everything that has been happening since then is a degenerated version of that. That's how they describe it. But really, the only reason why it was perfect is because there were no seasons, there was no time. It wasn't real, So Saturn's remembered as being a benevolent entity during that time. He was the good King Saturn, and he ruled over this wonderful age. But afterwards, he's thought of as being the god of death, basically, because time equals death. And
then, the mythos of him eating his children.
Yeah, I think that's negating time. That's him trying. He as long as he was the king of the golden age, he was able to keep things perfect the way they were because he was, quote, eating his own children. Well, he's keeping the future from happening. But, once that got interfered with, and the story is that, Zeus, who, is imagined as being equivalent to Jehovah, according to Syncretism, Zeus, fought his father and rescued all of his siblings from his father's stomach. Those all became the planets, or what the Gnostics conceived of as the archons, the people, the entities in control of everything here in creation. So those entities in control of creation weren't allowed to exist and do their job until Zeus finally broke the power of his father. But all of this, of course, didn't actually happen in a linear time. So it was like all this stuff, we can only look at it in retrospect, and we have these stories of things that happened in the time, but none of it could have happened in the way we imagined it because there wasn't any time. So it's one of those mysteries.
Yeah, I'd say that's the understatement of of a lifetime. But yeah, it's very fun to think about this abstract, these concepts. If we did have this fourth dimension that's outside of our concept of reality and space and time, where you have pure potentiality, and everything that's ever happened or everything that ever could happen exists within that realm. And then we get into this idea of multiple timelines, and then, attention, and then, bringing things into reality by realizing them or looking at them as, on the quantum level. And it's there does seem to be, at least in the way that the news and everything in the media that we're surrounded in, there does seem to be this attachment to fear and this negative side of the whole deal.
Well, one of the things we talked about in the book, we talked about the dark baptism of wisdom that we think some groups might have practiced, including perhaps the Templars. This is really just, there's several ways I arrived at this idea, but one of the things it matches up with, one of the things I think that illustrates the idea is this casket that, may or may not have anything to do with the Templars, but, the one in the British Museum. One of the things it depicts on the cover is this character whom Hammer Purgstall thought was Baphomet. He calls her meat. He says that's what the inscriptions say. It says the word meat, which he kind of matches up with the word metis, a Greek word for mind or wisdom.
Okay.
And so he says that, this figure is depicted actually several times in the pictures in his book. There's several different versions of it. So in other versions of this, you see a woman who kind of looks like the goddess Cybele, and she's got breasts, but she's also got a beard. So she kind of looks hermaphroditic. On the casket, you don't really see a beard, but it's definitely meat. And in all of these depictions of meat, she's pulling these chains down. It looks like they were attached to her legs, but also on the casket version, they are attached to a inverted sun and an inverted moon, one on each side. And so it looks like she's not only taking the shackles off of her own legs, but pulling the sun and the moon down from the heavens. And you also see the stars too, like at least in some versions of it, you see the stars that represent the archons, the planetary rulers of this existence.
Sure.
So what it is like, I think, and there's Gnostic terminology that matches up with this. This is freeing yourself basically from the influence of the archons. Not only that, but actually destroying what they've created and what they were ruling over, pulling them down from their spheres. So in other words, I think, this is basically a depiction of the destruction of creation, which certainly a lot of Gnostic groups would have applauded. They thought it was a flaw and an error to create this world in the first place. So I don't know if that was the Templars' view. Possibly, they were at least playing with the idea. And one of the reasons why I think they might have been persuaded by the spirits they were talking to to play around with this idea and maybe do rituals that are meant to hasten the end of the world and the end of existence, really, is that some of the spirits I talked to, they definitely were indicating that they were in the underworld, not just in some outer world outside of our universe, but specifically the underworld, specifically in prison, in Hades, in hell, and that they wanted to get out. And in fact, we've caught them playing with us in a way where it seems like they're trying to persuade us to let them possess us. And by us, I mean me and, whichever partner I happen to be doing the Ouija board with at the time. But they're like trying to persuade us to let them possess us, trying to persuade us to do rituals. And this seems to be what the goal of the rituals is to either hasten the end of the world somehow, and not just the world, but the universe, and also to, let them out of their prison, whether you're letting them out through your own body, because your body could be a portal, or, opening up other portals and other ways to free them from their prison. And one of the things I sort of decoded from looking at different myths and stuff, I put a lot of this stuff at the end of the Clock Shavings book, as this idea of the idea is that there's pillars holding up the heavens.
Yeah.
And that if, those pillars were to be severed at any point, then the heaven would crash into and meld with this universe. And then, it might all cancel itself out and everything be destroyed. And of course, Hades would also be broken open and everything would all mesh together. Which, like I said, could result in total destruction, which might be a welcome relief to these beings if they're in a state of torture, constant and everlasting torture. They might like for it all to just come to an end. And then, of course, the Bible talks about them being loosed from their prison. Revelation talks about this, and at least for a short time, having their way with us and partying and having a good time until the second death that happens at the end. The spirits we were talking to, definitely, it seems like that, their motivation kind of matches up with that idea. So I think that Templars might have been doing something similar.
There's so many different ways that you could look at this, and I'm thinking about that picture where you have this hermaphrodite pulling down, the sun and the moon, and also the fact that they think that there's this black hole in the middle of our galaxy, and that having some pull on us, and thinking about, the hourglass and that point of equilibrium, and then I'm thinking back to when we were talking about, the magnets, and if there's this electromagnetic something being broadcast from a distant, something, or near Sirius, and we see all these other different channels that say that's where they're getting their information. And then as you're talking about these pillars, they can represent many different things, either good and evil or masculine and feminine. And with those coming down, I guess thinking about this convergence and reconciliation of all opposites, and then everything going back into a central point of unity. I just don't know. I can't say whether or not that's a good thing. I mean, I guess it could be. But maybe. I mean, who knows?
I feel the same way. I feel a lot of reticence. I mean, I certainly can understand why someone would think of existence as being unpleasant and might want an end to it, but it's still, too scary. And it's like, why give up the game if it's not over,
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same as it's like committing suicide, only on a, mass universal scale. And in the case of people wanting to commit suicide, I almost always say, unless the fix is in and you've got a terminal illness, why not keep it up, to see what happens? And
at least give it a whirl.
I just don't. Exactly. I mean, why do these Gnostics want to just go and destroy everything?
Yeah.
You don't know. I mean, at that point, what? It's over. There's nothing left to do. No more fun. and or anything else for that matter. So anyway, I mean, I understand that people, have had this view. I mean, certainly, I mean, even Zen Buddhists have a similar point of view, don't you think? Isn't that what they're talking about? Destroying existence, basically,
Yeah,
as the ultimate view, ultimate goal of everything.
sure. Yeah, it's
So,
the ending of the suffering and you know yeah, that's a big parallel. Um,
so it's interesting that Zen Buddhists are always saying, sort of withhold yourself, pull yourself back from existence, and that'll keep you from reincarnating over and over again, and you'll go back to the big zero, where you came from. But then a lot of the Gnostics, it seemed, had the opposite view, that instead of being an ascetic, essentially, that you should plunge yourself into these sort of evil seeming rituals in order to uh, turn back nature, and that will somehow release you from the bonds of existence. So you have the same goal, but two totally opposite approaches. But there were Gnostic groups that also had the ascetic approach as well. So it's all very strange.
well, I wish we had more time. We're already at the end. But if you can let people know where they can find more of your work and what we can and when we can expect to see this new couple books you got coming out, and just where we can find more.
Okay, well, my website is tracytwyman.com or tracyrtwyman.com. They both get you there, where you can find all the articles, links to all my books, and all of my books are on Amazon. The new one will probably be in the process of being published by the time that this interview goes to air. So the expected publication date is the 31st, this weekend. And, within a couple of weeks of that, it should be available for purchase. We're hoping to be able to have it available by Black Friday. So,
Awesome, perfect timing.
yeah.
I guess while the veil is thinnest.
It wasn't planned this way either. I mean, I told you, I just finished editing today, but it's working out.
Yeah, it's well, it was great talking with you. I had no idea which rabbit holes we were going to go down, but I think it's been very timely and very pertinent. And you've just got a wealth of information. Keep up the good work, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Zach. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Well,
so let's get this party started. A woman who's not afraid to stare into the heart of darkness and say, "Is that all you got?" Tracy Twyman, welcome back to the higher side.
Thank you so much, Greg. I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I really love having you here. And this novel is fascinating, and it goes into some really dark places. It gets into those things at the deepest end of the conspiracy pool, ritualistic rape and murder by the puppet masters of the planet. And obviously, we've had a couple related dust-ups in the news cycle related to these things since we last talked. But to kick this off, since we're talking about a novel, can you help clarify where the line is between fact and fiction in this new book? Because it seems pretty detailed and well-researched, but maybe the names have been changed to protect the author?
Well, I mean, it should be fairly easy if you read it all the way to tell where the line is, but there's some definite caveats and disclosures I need to make ahead of time. So if you read, you'll notice the main character, Pamela Auger, seems a lot like me because she has a job kind of like mine, writing books like mine. She has books that are like mine, except with slightly changed titles. So she is kind of like me, but she has a more exciting life, and she's a little bit better suited to having adventures, so she doesn't have a husband and a child. I don't think I even said what age she was. I imagined her being a little bit younger and more fit and just more able to, jump around and spring around the world if she needs to. And that's where I left it, because I didn't want to really tell people what to imagine too much. I kind of just told the story. And as far as the characters were concerned, I do give a bit of description, but I really leave a bit to the imagination too. Some of the other characters involved, people will recognize as being based on historical figures and figures in current news and current events. So certainly there's a villain that is kind of based on Michael Bloomberg. And the reason for this is because when I was formulating this whole idea, which was about August and September of last year, I really my first idea was just to write about just secret society cult type organizations doing, rituals with children, rape rituals based on the Knights Templar. And I imagine something having to do with, the deep web and some of this dark pornography that's spread there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started to formulate that. I decided I wanted to have it set in London. And I remembered this monument that I had seen. My previous husband's name, Brian, he's deceased now. He and I were in England in 2005, and we came across this thing when we were just walking down the Strand, which is in the city of London, that borough. There's a district of London called the City of London, which is the financial district. And so we were walking through there. We ran across this thing that was an ancient temple of Mithras that, had been discovered. It was left over from the old Roman city of Londinium that pre-existed everything else there in England, in London, before it was called England. And so anyway, there's this ancient Roman temple, to the god Mithras, but it had been moved to where we stumbled upon it from its original location, which was just really a few feet down the road. But when they found it, which they found it in 1954, when they were excavating to try to build an office building, and they actually had to build the office building right away. So they didn't even really have time to do proper archaeology there, but they picked up the temple and moved it down the road and tried to reconstruct it as best they could. So the one I found was a poorly reconstructed version. And about a year, or not even a year ago, like 8 months ago, or whenever I started outlining this novel, I thought, oh, it would be great to mention the Temple of Mithras in the novel. So I just looked it up, refresh my memory about where it was located. And I came to find out that, since 2005, last time I was in England, Michael Bloomberg has purchased the land on which the original Temple of Mithras, the place where it had been discovered. And he's building he was calling it his European headquarters when he originally started trying to do this. But then Britain pulled out of the EU. So I think that's why he's now calling it just his London headquarters. But anyway, he's building this huge building. It's going to be the biggest building in terms of land mass and I guess just the mass of the materials that's being used. It's one of the largest construction projects, in other words, that has occurred in London. And so it's going to be right there where the original Temple of Mithras was. And he's already done it, really, moved the reconstructed temple back to its original place, the exact same spot where it used to be. And he's going to try to renovate it better than ever. So anyway, when I discovered this, I thought, well, I have to have, a scene there at that temple. And then I started researching Mithraism and Cybele worship, which I had already decided I was going to work into the story somehow. And it all just sort of came together perfectly. And it became this, I know I need to wind down my answer here, but that became the, opening point at which everything that I had planned on putting in my story sort of came together in this magical way that I didn't even realize was as perfect as it turned out to be. So, so the location is based on a real location, which is this real Temple of Mithras has been moved to this place. And the new Bloomberg building is going to be opened. And, well, they told me before the third quarter of this year. When I started writing this, they weren't saying. So I just projected and I said, well, maybe it'll happen by March of 2018. And then there were some very important dates having to do with the end of March in 2018 that ended up becoming part of the story. The main character is based on Bloomberg, but, it's a lot. In a lot of ways, he's different, too, because my character is interested in a lot of really deep subjects, a lot of esoteric occult subjects. And he's interested in philosophy and surrealist art and stuff. And of course, he's involved in some really nefarious things like raping children and murdering people. And all of these are things that I have no reason to believe Michael Bloomberg is doing. So I guess that's where the fact and fiction separate.
Right. Fair enough. And I do find this Mithras temple find really intriguing. The idea that Bloomberg is concerned about it at all is fascinating. I mean, to the elite, places are so important, and also how things were in the ancient world. They always seem to try to be manifesting prophecy and all kinds of strange stuff that does often center around locations like this. And another thing you've said about this in one of your blogs was that this Bloomberg place is supposed to be like the smartest building in Europe, built to generate its own energy and even share it with nearby buildings. And you mentioned technology to maximize the efficiency of the workers inside. And I just went to a conference on consciousness with like really far out Tech Valley speakers, like guys from Google and all that stuff. And one of them did talk about this very company he started that is supposed to have something. I imagined it working like a Wi-Fi signal, like just radiating an area in a signal. But that's what it's about, is measuring brain waves and trying to biohack your way to greater efficiency. And I was like, wow, I mean, this is really what they're talking about. Like, just having economic slaves isn't enough. You really want to squeeze every last bit of blood out of them that you can. It's messed up.
Yeah, well, I mean, reality, again, was provided, everything I needed to create this fictional story. And then, I mean, the whole thing just turned into this magical process, because I would write things, come up with things in my own mind that I thought were just totally made up. And in fact, I thought were kind of unbelievable. And then, I just do a little bit of research, try to work things in, try to see what I could do to back it up a little bit. And I'd find out that I'm exactly right, or that, something that I had dreamed up. Sometimes it would happen a couple days after I wrote about it in my story and I hadn't shown it to anyone. Something very similar would happen in the news. As far as the building is concerned, first I said to myself, oh, this Temple of Mithras is great. I got to have some scenes here. I started looking into the building that Michael Bloomberg is going to put there. And it's based on, there's another building, I guess, in, I'm going to say the Netherlands. Yes, it's the Netherlands. And there's this Dutch designer who came up with a lot of these ideas. I forget what the name of, they've got this term, I guess it's in Dutch, that means the new work. And here's what it is, man. So, you described some of it. In Bloomberg's planned building, there's something called a digital ceiling. And it's super energy efficient. It knows everything that everyone's doing beneath it, right? So it's monitoring you with a camera, with all kinds of other sensors that would monitor your heat and, following each individual around the building as they go. And the purpose of this, they say, is energy efficiency. So they'll know when you're going somewhere, when you've just arrived, they need to provide more light and heat in that area, for instance. And the building is smart enough to figure out what your patterns are, your habits, during the day. So it'll try to anticipate them. And then there's this other thing where in this building, one of these new work kind of buildings, including Bloomberg's, people will not have their own desks. They must try to score a desk when they get to work. And they're discouraged from using the same desk every day. And they get lockers to put their possessions in, because the tables that they have don't have drawers or anything. So you're supposed to put your things in a locker, and you shouldn't even use the same locker 2 days in a row. And another thing is, like, especially the executives, people kind of in charge of certain departments and stuff, they can set up little codes that the digital ceiling will read, so they can make like a hand gesture or something, and it will know what in the building needs to happen next. And it can signal robots to come and bring you food, or just all sorts of things. Bloomberg's building is going to be crawling with, self-sufficient robots. And the building that it's kind of inspired by in the Netherlands is also, already doing that. The gate to the parking garage opens up, right before you drive in, because it senses your card, it knows who you are, and it, it opens up to greet you. And then you've had a thing about how, there's going to be a gym, an exercise room, and all the exercise equipment is hooked up to generators, so that while you're exercising, you're generating energy. And the windows themselves are solar panels. And in fact, from what I was reading, all the new buildings, ones that are built with any kind of decent budget, the big skyscrapers and stuff, they're all going to soon be covered with these windows that are actually sucking in solar energy too. So he's got this amazing, building that he's building with this idea of, yes, being energy efficient, but also trying to, with this new work concept where no one's allowed to have a desk or anything, supposedly try to make you interact more with the other employees or something. To me, I would never want to go to work. It sounds awful.
Right,
So,
right.
What do you think, Greg? Would you want to work in a place like that?
Absolutely not. I mean, obviously, some of that stuff from the technology standpoint sounds pretty appealing, but it does also seem like it's a lot of razzle dazzle to hide some potential darkness and a more cutthroat work environment for sure. And I don't think we need any more of that. But is there anything else we should say about this location of esoteric significance, either in the ancient world or the Temple of Mithras aspect, rather than Bloomberg's building itself?
Well, I have had my theories about what the significance might be. You can tell it's a very significant spot, and here's why. For one thing, it's right next to several buildings that are important to, finance, particularly in England. And of course, thus by extension, the rest of the world, because London still is very much kind of the center of finance in a lot of ways, and like the gold and silver prices are still fixed there. They still lead in a lot of ways the global markets. And so it's symbolically and in truth very significant for the world economy. London is, and in particular, this district called the City of London, which is really the original London. I mentioned there was Londinium, the ancient Roman city. Well, this quote City of London, which is now just a district of London, that's the original Roman city. The walls of this district basically still correspond to what those original Roman walls were. And the Romans had this object called the London Stone. Well, we don't know what they called it, but it's now called the London Stone. And it's believed to go back to the Romans, and that they theorized they used to use it as I think they call it a malarium stone. So what it is it's the stone that you would put in the middle of the city, or, if not the exact middle, like the most significant area in the city, and kind of try to put it in the middle. And you measure everything else in the city out from that point. So anyway, that's what they think this rock originally was. Well, it's been symbolically significant to the City of London even before England became a country. And, people theorize that maybe this stone was involved with the coronation of chieftains and stuff before there were kings of England. And then even after England got created, the City of London continued to be its own separate entity legally. And so there's a tradition that even the monarch has to ask permission from the legal head of the City of London, which is this position called Lord Mayor. So the Queen, theoretically or traditionally should ask the Lord Mayor for permission to enter the City of London. So right here in the heart of the City of London, right where this London Stone object used to be and will again, I believe, according to what I've read, it'll be returned there again soon. So in this location, that's the location that Michael Bloomberg chose to put his building. That's where the Temple of Mithras originally was. And there's an underground river that flows right through it. There's several underground rivers in London, and this is one of the important ones. It's called the Walbrook. And right next to Bloomberg's building, there's several other important buildings, such as the Rothschild building. This is the building it's called New Court. It's been rebuilt several times, but it is the same plot of land that the Rothschilds have been possessing and controlling in London, since 1700, since they began their, financial control of England, and then, other territories as well. So this is kind of, ground zero of at least that particular aspect of their empire. And also, so the Bank of England is right next to it. The London Bullion Market, where they used to, up until about a year ago, set the price of gold and silver in that building. That building is right there. And so, you've got the London Stone, you've got the Temple of Mithras, Bank of England, London Bullion Market Association, all right there in this plot of land that's right around this street called Bucklersbury. And it's shaped like a Superman diamond, which is something I mentioned in the book and has a great deal of significance. But
Right.
So all these things are right there. I think it's important. Little bit of a spoiler, but I kind of think it's related to the myth that England is built on top of the island rests on top of the tomb of Kronos. So and this goes back to the Greeks. They said that Kronos was built, after the Titans got dethroned by the Olympian gods, Kronos and his buddies got put in this tomb, they call it, but he's a god, so he's not really dead. So it's more like a prison, and he's kind of sleeping there. And they described it as being underneath the British Isles. And for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that Mithras is considered the same as Saturn. Mithras is this Persian deity that was imported to the Roman Empire,
Right.
And, worshipped by Romans in the late part of the Roman Empire. So Mithras is Saturn. Saturn is Kronos. These are all names for the same figure. So you've got a temple to Mithras right there, to Kronos, Saturn. And you've got a myth that Kronos is buried and kind of locked away in a tomb underneath England. So I think it's right there. I think that's the location. There's a number of other reasons why I think that too, most of which I explain eventually one way or another in the book. But yeah, that's what I think is going on there. So it's kind of like, one of these center of the world kind of areas. It's a very sacred spot, I think.
Right. Yeah, I love that nexus of symbolism around Mithras, Kronos, Saturn. There are researchers out there who talk about the black sun, or even it ties into the electric universe, that Saturn might have once been our sun, and just really weird stuff. But it seems to be important to them, at least, and it's pretty clear the elite want to control certain spots on the planet for deep esoteric reasons that they aren't sharing with us. And before we do get too deep, we should probably talk about those ancient cults of Mithras and Cybele. You mentioned Cybele earlier. I think people probably know a little less about that particular entity. But let's discuss maybe the symbolism and traditions surrounding them, because I guess the suggestion is that in some elite occult circles, at least some of these traditions might still be intact.
Well, yes. And one of the vectors through which these traditions have continued on, I think, is through Templarism, which then influenced Freemasonry and the OTO and a bunch of other Western esoteric groups. But let's just start with Cybele worship, for instance, which goes back way further. She was worshipped in the history of the Romans way further back in history than Mithras. And, it is, again, a import from Phrygia, from Anatolia, but they, incorporated it well into their culture to the point where she kind of became an embodiment of the state to them. She's the mother goddess. And so she's considered equivalent to sort of kind of like Gaia and Rhea, these kinds of mother goddesses from Greek mythology. I make the point in the book that I think these are the same figure, and I'm not just mashing all the girl goddesses together, I'm not being sexist. There's a real reason why I think all these characters really are the same thing. So Cybele's worship was marked with two very particular types of rituals. One was the castration of the priests. The priests would go into a frenzy during this festival to Cybele that would happen once a year at the end of March. They'd have a parade. They'd go walking down the street drunk and on drugs, go into a, religiously induced frenzy. And then the priests, or the wannabe priests, the ones that were being inducted into the priesthood, would castrate themselves with a knife right there in front of everybody. And this is all in homage to Attis, who's Cybele's son. And the whole mythology of Cybele and Attis is really the main myth of the Cybele worship. So the story is that she was a goddess, the mother goddess. She had a son. She initially, according to the more detailed versions of the story, didn't want him and exposed him, left him for dead basically as an infant and left him alone. But someone else found him, raised him up. And then when he became an adult, or not even an adult really, but when he began to mature, and he was like a prepubescent child, is how I take it from the description, she fell in love with him. And depending on which version of the story you read, some kind of gloss over this part, but it kind of seems like, if you go into the more detailed versions, that she had a sexual relationship with him when he was young. But then he wanted to marry a woman, when he grew up, and they were going to get married. In some versions of the story, they're actually at the altar, getting married. And Cybele shows up, and according to some versions, well, the most common version is just that she filled him with madness, deliberately inducing him to castrate himself. And then he bled out and died. And, that was her revenge to him for loving someone else. But then the story goes that she felt bad, she felt guilty, she missed him. And so either 1 to 3 days later, depending on the version, she resurrected him. And then this is celebrated in the rites of Attis. So this would all happen in the same week, the last week of March, ending on April 1st. So one day they'd celebrate the castration. A few days later, they celebrate his resurrection. And, again, it's all, synced up with the similar kinds of death and resurrection rites we have now with Jesus.
Right.
So it's all tied into Easter.
Mm-hmm.
So in my story, by the way, Easter, this is true. Next year, Easter and April Fool's Day will be the same day. April 1st next year is going to be Easter. So I utilize that in my story. We haven't had this kind of confluence of April Fool's Day and Easter since 1956. So I tied that in with my story because I had, the Temple of Mithras that was discovered in 1954. I had some important events in the story taking place between those 2 years. So this is like, when you're reading the story now, we're kind of recreating things that happened the last time there was an Easter on April Fool's Day, which, by the way, April Fool's Day is linked up with Easter and with the fact that we used to have, in the West, we used to have that as kind of New Year's Day was April 1st for some countries in the West up until, I forget, it was like 200 or 300 years ago. Anyway, so they still call this day Lady Day, or the day that it's linked up with. I know I'm getting something wrong here because I'm trying to remember what was, I have to look it up. Lady Day was like maybe the 25th. I don't know. It's all explained in the book. But Lady Day, April Fool's Day, and this other date of, celebrating it as New Year's Day. All these things are linked together. The reason why they would call it April Fool's Day is that's sort of a joke on the people that were still considering it to be, the New Year's Day. Mm-hmm. So a long explanation, but anyway, that's some of the use of the Cybele symbolism that comes up.
Interesting.
And there's way more. Greg, if you have time, I can tell you all about Cybele.
Well, I have heard you talk about Cybele a little more and really emphasize this idea of being represented by a rock or a hermaphroditic rock. And I think that's pretty interesting because I like that panspermia perspective that perhaps an asteroid landed here and unpacked itself and eventually manifested man who will then eventually manifest some tech form. It's a really interesting concept, but a lot of people have suggested, the Dome on the Rock is just an asteroid, and people, they kind of laugh about that. But if it really was the source of life on Earth potentially, then maybe there's deeper significance there than people realize. But I just liked that idea of the hermaphroditic rock, and it could be an asteroid that contained two sexes that built everything we have now. So that's kind of weird. But I guess I would ask, Cybele and Mithras, is there some linkage between there?
I think so. And the things that I found proved it to me. The interesting thing is that I would say modern myth experts and history experts try to debunk the idea that there's any real link between these two cults. But if you go back to the early 20th century and the late 19th century, the writings that were being done about Mithras back then, and I would suggest Jesse Weston has a good book about the subject that gets into the subject. From Ritual to Romance is good. And then also Franz Cumont wrote several books about Mithras. So if you want to get, where I'm getting some of my information, that's a good place to go. Anyway, here's the idea. Okay, so first of all, yes, you've got Cybele was worshipped as a rock, and there's statues of her that they claim were carved from a meteorite, a stone from heaven that was her, and then they made a statue out of her. And then there's also references to her as a rock where there's no statue involved. You just envision people worshiping a rock, which I think is why some authors have theorized that maybe the one at the Kaaba, the black stone at the Kaaba, might actually be the Cybele stone. Because I don't think we have the stone that they were really worshiping as Cybele. I think that that's been lost. So I don't think we really know what it really looked like. But yeah, I think originally there was this idea she's a stone and she fell from heaven. They link her with this other, I think it's just another name for the same goddess, another Phrygian name. So Agditis is another name for the same person. And they describe this figure as being originally hermaphroditic. And then the other gods in heaven thought that this creature was a freak and they didn't like it. So they cut her penis off and then cast her out of heaven. So there you have the idea of the rock, Cybele coming from heaven, but it has been castrated now. So now it's a goddess. And then she gives birth to a son, right? And that son is celebrated as Attis. But then we also have this other Phrygian god, Mithras. Now, Mithras is born from a rock. And it's just like, as if, there's just a stone there on the ground. It pops open and there's this guy comes out. And he's holding, they always show him coming out of the rock, holding in one hand a knife and in the other hand a torch so he can see, in the realm that he's coming into. So it's like the rock is sort of a portal, but it's also an egg. It's like there's a universe inside that egg, and then he comes out and now he's in this universe and he's the god of this universe. And this is what I found over and over again in the kinds of rituals and myths that I ended up dealing with for this story. That is the story they seem to be telling. Mithras is like, and I'm using sort of the most developed versions of the story, when you've got all the different lines of influence coming together at the late Roman Empire, when they've taken the Persian myth and mixed in their own stuff. Then you get this god who's like Saturn, but he conquers the sun. He conquers all these other gods, and he becomes God himself. This story of him emerging from the rock, and then there's these stories of him, slaying a bull and encountering all these other figures. There's always in Mithraeums a picture of him shaking hands with Saul, and then Saul kneeling to him. So go ahead.
Oh, no, I think it's all so interesting. And I had Chris Knowles on the show not long ago, and he was talking about the symbolism of that Prometheus statue at Rockefeller Center, or that statue that they say is Prometheus. And he was taking a deeper look at it and how the figure isn't actually chained to the rock, but looks like it's emerging from it. And he was suggesting that they're basically hiding that this might be actually a statue of Mithras. And it does seem like there's a lot of layers to what they're really into deep below the surface. But how should we maybe tie this to modern day? Because I think a lot of people would assume these old traditions and cults would have just died out, along with the things they used to partake in. But what suggests it's still going on? Clearly, Bloomberg has an interest in that Mithras temple. But do we see other indications that they're still very interested in this stuff?
Oh, yeah. And I'll try to work that into my answer here, because I want to sort of add something to what I was just saying about the rock and Mithras, okay? The story of Mithras, there's a version of it that kind of elaborates on what happens next and how he has his own son. He creates his own heir, right? They say that Mithras hated women, and the Mithras cult was an all-male cult. And they even, the rituals they had, the kind of phrases they used in the rituals, you can tell they did not like women. And so this myth says Mithras himself did not like women, but he wanted an heir. He wanted a son. So he ejaculated onto a rock, and the rock became pregnant, and a child came from that, which they say is Fanny's. It's like the the Orphic egg came from that. So an Orphic egg is, it's a universe in itself. So what we have here is a story of a god who came from a rock himself and then went on to create another god and another universe, really, with the same process of ejaculating onto a rock. So, okay, this is all interesting because I think it ties in with this idea, that we're in a matrix or a false reality. You mentioned the Saturn cube idea, which is so popular now.
Right.
The idea that the figure of Saturn, whatever he is created some kind of world of illusion for us to live in, and we're inside of this box. Well, so, I think that that's what this story is hinting at about Mithras. But of course, whoever came up with it wouldn't have known anything about computers or virtual reality or anything. And really, that's the version of these ideas that we have now in our reality. But there's a lot of other ways you could picture the same thing kind of happening. We have computers with buttons on them now. Maybe it's something else in another dimension. So I think this is a story about Mithras breaking out of one false artificial prison world and then making his own, and I think that the elite, there's some of them that have the same idea because, last year you had a story that came out that was in the news, reprinted in several different, mainstream newspapers and magazines. They all had kind of paraphrased versions of the same story where they were saying there's a group of billionaires, and they wouldn't give it a name. It wasn't like a secret society or anything. They just said there's a group of billionaires, secret, because they're secret. There was not like a name to the group or anything. But they said that these billionaires are working secretly on some kind of way to break us out of the matrix. They believe we're in a simulation and they're going to break us out. And then that story just went. Nobody addressed it again. There was no elaboration on who these guys are or what they're doing. And it was right around the time the story came out, just as I'm already writing this story. And I didn't intend on using that idea in my story, but it ended up just going there. That's where the information led me. And so, that's the kind of thing, I guess, that, not to spoil it too much, but that is the sort of thing that the villain in my story is aiming towards, and using the building as a technology device to do that is part of the story.
Yeah, I really do love those ideas that the elite's true plan and agenda is to try to jailbreak this enclosure. It gets into that idea of subverting the gods, the whole Lucifer motif. We see a lot of Lucifer symbolism. And it really does get to that place of wondering, is the entity that built this thing, is the creator of this construct, a positive or negative entity? I know you did a great show with Marty Leeds, who I really like and who has really become a friend of mine and is a pretty clear proponent of the flat earth model. Of course, Marty is an optimist, and our biggest disagreement is about that stuff. Like, is this creator entity positive or negative? If it's a negative entity who has this on some prison planet archonic energy farm, then maybe the elite's plan to jailbreak it isn't so bad. But if it is supposed to be some paradise crafted by an altruistic being, then they're definitely up to no good. So it's really just depends on how you view the moral alignments of these characters.
Well, I think that what I ended up finding in my research, because I got deep into the secrets of the OTO, for instance. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've seen things that only a handful of people on Earth have seen.
Damn.
Other than, other OTO initiates. Not very many non-initiates have seen what I've seen. And yeah, so I got into researching the rituals of Aleister Crowley and the kind of stuff that he was into, and also just alchemy, which, I've been looking at sort of bewilderedly for years and trying to make head or tail of. I figured out years ago that it involves some recipe of human blood and body parts and things like that, and the human soul, utilizing all this stuff somehow.
Shit.
But it seems to me what I found is a technology, a magical technology. And I'm not saying I know all the ins and outs of how it works, but I deconstructed the symbolism of these secret rituals and recipes. And they're talking about ways of creating your own universe and destroying the one you're in now. And you could actually just look at it as you are trying to break out of the prison you're in now. And in the process, you'll probably end up destroying the one that you came from. So I believe that I found secret encoded magical instructions on how to become your own god. And in the process, you either destroy or imprison, or it's kind of can be seen as both the world that you come from.
Yeah.
And you can see this when you look at some of the things that are easy to find are the Equinox of the Gods ritual that the OTO engages in. There's writings that Aleister Crowley had about creating a homunculus
Right.
through sex magic, and usually involves some kind of unnatural birth. His idea, what he thought would be the most potent way to do it, would be to somehow impregnate an anus and have an anal birth. So that all made its way into the story. Gotta warn you guys, it's pretty gruesome, but it's definitely something that Aleister Crowley was writing about.
Right.
And when he's talking about an anal birth, he's talking about the anal birth of a universe. And he totally wrote about that in his diaries, if you look. So, there's, I guess the question of whether it's bad or good for us to be in a prison, I don't think that there's an answer to that. It depends on what side, I guess, you're on, in or out, right? So if you're on the outside and you have a little snow globe that entertains you, then you like it and you think it's good. But if you're in the snow globe and then you realize that your world is fake, you might not like it.
Right.
And especially if you realize, this is what I think is happening. The world that is either created by the god and also possibly the world that he leaves and ascends to, to become higher than, I think that those worlds can be used as batteries, machines creating energy for you. So I think that that's going on now. And, to the extent that we have energy being siphoned out of our world and given to someone else on the outside, that means that we are slaves. And so, from that perspective, it seems bad.
Right.
But I don't think there's any way to escape it without doing that to somebody else.
That is, that's pretty dark. And I guess, does this all culminate in what you're calling the conquering of the sun ritual? Can you detail that piece for us?
Yeah, I'll try to. Yeah. This is a concept that I just found is in all of the Greek creation myths, and you can pretty much find it in a lot of the older, major cultures' creation myths. And then it's in alchemy. It's in almost all of the alchemical pictures and manuscripts. So what it is it's the idea that each cycle, the Greeks, for instance, broke everything down into ages. The Gnostics called these things aeons. And each of these cycles had a different major god that was in charge of everything. So the Greeks have these stories of, first you have Uranus and Gaia. So you have heaven and earth. Then they split apart. And in the space in between them, then these other cycles occur. Uranus is overthrown in the process of being split apart from his mate. And then, I'll try not to get too detailed here, but that story is about, Uranus and Gaia originally are one hermaphroditic being. And they're kind of like having sex constantly, and having children. They're engendering children inside the womb of the female half of the being, but then those children cannot get out. And so the myth tells about how Uranus was afraid that he was going to be usurped by one of his children. And so he didn't want them to be born. And then they tell this story of how Gaia gave Saturn or Kronos, one of the children inside of her, a knife to use to castrate their father. And that's how Uranus gets overthrown by Saturn.
Right.
And then they say that heaven and earth got separated. And then that's how that creation exists. And that it will cease existing if they ever come back together again somehow. And then they say that Atlas, who is one of the Titans, was punished with the burden of holding up heaven and earth. Now you've got this story, it goes on. So first you got the era of the Titans and ruled over by Kronos. And that's remembered as being the golden age. Then you have Saturn overthrown by Zeus, and the Titans are said to be locked in Tartarus. And like I said, they're still there, supposedly. They're still alive. They're underneath us somehow. So I'm going through this story here and incorporating it into my fiction story. And I realized, I thought, well, okay, Zeus was the main god then during the Olympian period. Did they ever say that Zeus got overthrown by anyone? And at first I'm thinking, well, that's dumb because the Greeks would never have said that. He was their god. So it'd be like us saying, oh, God's dead.
Yeah.
Which we did say that.
Yep, Nietzsche
so maybe there is a comparison there. But anyway, actually, they do have some specifics about who would have been Zeus's heir. And they say that it was Apollo, who was a sun god. And this caused me to think, well, okay, people always compare Christianity to sun worship. And Jesus is always depicted as the sun or having a kind of a solar halo behind his head. And then all these Christian rituals are, timed to old pagan holidays, usually having to do with whatever the sun's doing at that part of the year, equinoxes and solstices and things like that. So, we definitely have kind of a solar worship going on now.
Absolutely.
And I wondered, everyone says that's the ancient worship of the ancient peoples, but then they were worshiping Jupiter. So to try to tighten everything up, it occurred to me that maybe this position of main god can be likened to the sun, and that we have different cycles in which someone else plays the role of the sun.
Yeah. I could see that. I mean, it's pretty deep stuff. And as we're getting to kind of the halfway point here, I wanted to read something from this great post you have on your blog called Mad Love, and it kind of ties in a lot of the stuff that we've talked about so far. But you say, I have revealed a number of symbols, some of them treasured as concealing great spiritual mysteries in the Hermetic traditions of Western occultism, which all seems to be related to the ideas of raping children, consuming human flesh, and using the bodies of victims, both dead and alive, to breed supernatural entities, golems, homunculi, and many other things. The souls that are incarnated in these rites are ensnared by the magicians performing them, seduced into coming into our world, and then trapped inside of a carnal container of some sort. And that is freaky stuff, but it is in line with what a lot of people think is going on. I guess, do you have any idea what happens next, or what happens to these beings once they're trapped or created, and how they're used? I mean, obviously our world goes on without a lot of people knowing about this, so I don't know how epic it is, but do we know how far this goes beyond the stories of Crowley we've heard? Maybe something in the last 100 years?
Well, okay, I have my own theories, and, anyone's free to just make up whatever they want, I guess. But basically, I think that when I'm talking about this ritual of conquering the sun, that ties in here, because I saw this being depicted in, like I said, alchemical stories. And then there's actually two kind of fictional versions of the old alchemical stories that have been utilized in modern times. Well, I'll tell you about Jodorowsky's film, The Holy Mountain. This really kind of spelled it out to me. I thought I was seeing this pattern, and then I watched his film again, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's totally what's going on. Because his film, he's open about it. It's an alchemical allegory, and he says it's based on two things. The Invisible Mountain book by Damal, forgetting the name of it now. Maybe it's called The Invisible Mountain or something. No, it's called Mount Analog. Okay. And then he's got this other one that he based it on, which is Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. So both Jodorowsky's Holy Mountain and its Inspiration, which is this book from the 1600s called The Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreutz. Maybe it's 1700s. Anyway, the story is about killing the 7 archons, the 7 planetary deities. that the ancients thought of as being in control of our whole world, and killing them and then regenerating them. So in both the Christian Rosenkreuz story and Jodorowsky's movie, you have people that are like embodying the, they have the spirits of these gods inside of them, and then they are killed or sacrificed. And then it's implied that a master alchemist can regenerate them. You're literally melting down their bodies.
Damn.
Separating their souls, using the blood and the body material, changing it alchemically through different scientific processes, and then using that to form new bodies of hosts that will hold the spirits of the ones that you've just sacrificed. And then you make them into a new sun and a new moon, which in the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosenkreuz, they're depicted as just having human bodies, okay? They're a new sun and a new moon, and they become the new king and queen of the universe, and they breed and create the other 5 classical planets, the other 5 gods. And there you have the gods of a new universe. So this is how I think it's done. You have to somehow entice the spirits of the 7 gods down from their seats in the heavens and get them to come into human bodies. And then you can trap them and, yes, sacrifice them and use those spirits then to make your own universe. And that's kind of the story I'm telling.
Yeah, it's so interesting, but it's that last part, creating your own universe, that I don't know. I just don't see. Maybe I don't see them because I don't recognize them, or maybe I can't tell what reality would be without this kind of magic going on in the Masonic basements all over the place. But I don't know. Have they made their own universe? I guess they kind of have. Depends on how you look at it.
Well, we wouldn't know. I mean, they might have a whole bunch of them. We might be in one of them now. And the way I'm envisioning it, it's almost like you could be in one of them and you could create some more either inside, or you could try to get out and create some more on the outside. And finding out what is inside and outside becomes very difficult at that point. It becomes relative, doesn't it?
It does.
And this is something I think is, true. Like, you can't really get a real perspective on what's up or down or in and out at a certain point. When you break down these stories down to their basics, things become very confusing. I mean, how is it that Saturn is the god of the highest realm up in the heavens, but at the same time, he's trapped in Tartarus, supposedly, beneath us?
Yeah.
So, I thought of it as the best you can do probably is just with the memories that you have in your own culture, try to arrange them chronologically and then view it as one thing stacked on top of another. So right now we're on top of Tartarus, supposedly. Well, that's got the remains of the Golden Age in it. It's got the remains of that other universe, but we're on top of it. And that, I think, is part of the symbolism of Atlas holding things up. Whoever's on the bottom of something else is, by definition, holding up the stuff on top. So this gets into the symbolism that you find in Christianity and Freemasonry. You've got the cornerstone and, the idea of this sacred place that's the foundation of something, whatever's on top of it. Another thing, too, is like this idea that we're slaves. Part of the slavery is that we're holding up the worlds that are set on top of us.
Right.
So
right.
I think we experience this. This is just me theorizing, just pontificating, just making stuff up. But this is how I feel, is we experience this in terms of how hard our lives seem to be. And, does it ever seem to you like the whole world is an inefficient machine? You're putting in so much work and getting so little out of it. And by definition, a machine should give you more product for the work that you put in. It should be increasing value somehow. Well, it feels to us like you just got value flying out the window. We can't figure out where it's going. And that, to me, is a sign that there is someone else sucking the juice off the top of us. And We just keep trying and trying, but we can't make it. There's this story about in Tartarus that there's these, I think they're called the Nereids or something. There's these 3 women that their punishment is to hold these jars of water, and they're constantly trying to fill the jars of water, but there's a hole in the bottom of them, so they're constantly leaking, so they'll never win. And that's how I think we are here in our universe. That is evidence that there's something else. There's a leak in the vessel somehow, but it's all part of the design,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I love that you said, we're holding up the illusionary constructs, because that's the kind of symbolism that I take in. I mean, when we're talking about created universes or false realities, that's what these things are. I mean, we're the ones holding up the things we're bound to, like contract law or debt-based currency and economic slavery. These are all illusions that we know are illusionary, but we buy into them. We live our life determined by them. And sure enough, none of them are natural. They're all created by these potentially occultists at the top of the pyramid. And so if you want indications that their magic is working, look at the goddamn mind control and the spell we're all under, that we literally don't do anything on this planet without green paper. So maybe we should look at those green paper printers. But man, another thing I wanted to ask you about is because you mentioned reality mirroring the themes of your book as you were writing it. And Pizzagate and spirit cooking are sort of old news now. Not that anything's been done about them, but the chatter, of course, has died down. During that time, you also wrote a lot of great articles breaking down some of the weirder symbols and phrases that came out in the glimpses that we saw. And since you do have such a deep knowledge of these arcane things, when you heard those phrases like spirit cooking and earthquake nights, along with some of the artwork that was involved, did this look like nonsense and gibberish to you, or did you find connections to deeper themes in mythology when you tried to unpack all that stuff?
Well, yeah, the Pizzagate thing broke out about a month and a half into my writing and outlining and stuff. And I guess I wouldn't say was that surprised, because the hints that was coming, they had already sort of released some stuff like, the New York police, they've got some videos and, they're going to be coming out soon, and it's got stuff to do with child sex, and it's going to make Hillary look bad. And I thought, okay, so this works out because the stuff I'm writing is going to, be timed perfectly with the news. But I had no idea that it was going to, be such a huge story, or that it was going to come out as soon as it did.
Right.
So, yeah, then the Pizzagate stuff happened. And my policy in general when I'm writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is I try to isolate myself from the news and from other humans as much as possible, so I won't be influenced by whatever is going on.
Right.
But I just got bombarded by messages one day. You have to look at Drudge Report. You have to look. Come on, just do it. And so I finally did. And yep, there's the spirit cooking was like in red letters across the top of Drudge Report. And so I had to pay attention. And sure enough, everything they were talking about was the kind of alchemical rituals I was talking about, including, yes, as you mentioned, references to earthquake nights. And I was already writing some stuff that's, a bit controversial, but it was about the symbolism I was seeing having to do with anal sex rituals and the creation of earthquakes, the disturbance of the earth by doing that. And, so again, it's only controversial just because people are so touchy about sexuality these days, and, everything is political. So anyway, what I was seeing is, that Aleister Crowley's sex magic is so much about, male homosexual anal rights. Okay. The deeper you go into OTO, the more homo and anal it gets. And then they start telling you, well, the best thing to do is actually do it with a kid. And so anyway, I should just give myself some legal cover, by the way. This is what I am seeing in the Aleister Crowley material that I am reading. I myself am not a member of the OTO, and I cannot tell you for a fact that they do anything with children. Okay. I'm saying what I see in Aleister Crowley's rights. But anyway, so, the stuff, Pizzagate came out. And she mentions earthquake nights. Again, I thought, well, that's just an interesting synchronicity. There's this thing in one of her videos about putting your head on the mineral pillow So again, that's the sacred rock. That's like Jacob's pillow. Anyway, so the Cybele rock and things like that. And then it's just so many of the other Pizzagate details that would come out over time ended up corresponding to things that I was writing about. So I was already putting some stuff in the book that corresponds to the myth of Pegasus, and the flying horse that comes out of the neck of Medusa when she's killed. Well, I wrote this scene, and then I decided to go to the Pizzagate forum that I hadn't been to in like a couple months, the VOAT page. And I go there, and what do you know? I find the word Pegasus right at the top of the page. And it's because they just discovered that there's this thing labeled the Pegasus Museum on Google Earth that it was a building that used to belong to one of these guys, Alephantis or one of them. And I guess the building has disappeared now. Nobody knows what happened there, but it was kind of suspected as being a place where, children were being held. So, I have a list somewhere of all these weird coincidences and things that happen. I guess not the least of which is just how much terrorism there is in London now, whereas London was not really much in the headlines at the time that I started writing. So I know that I picked the right spot, definitely, to have this story.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you are correct in that it gets pretty thorny because people's proclivities for talking about sexuality and sexual persuasion. But you can't deny that this stuff is in a lot of the mythology, the whole motif rising up and raping the father figure. And we didn't put it there. And I think of it less about hetero and homosexual and more about power and domination, because there is really no more complete way to own someone, especially two alpha male type figures. I mean, that's a complete and total owning. And I think it's more about power and control than it is about what gender you're attracted to. I guess that's the way I try to separate those issues from the source material.
Yeah, I usually would ignore such concerns, but it's been so heightened lately. And I know that I have fans that, I guess fit into any one of these categories, so I don't want to offend anybody.
Right.
But definitely, one of the things I was struck by when I researched the myths of Cybele and Mithras, for instance, was the fact that Cybele used to be a hermaphrodite. That just seemed so significant to me. And then, you got that story about Mithras doesn't like women, but he wants to breed without one. And then Cybele, a similar thing was said about her. She does not like women and she does not like men. So she tries to keep a middle gender between the two. This is a quote from one of the chroniclers, in ancient times. So Cybele is not just a hermaphrodite, but specifically despises the sex roles and, traditional men, traditional women. And then you got the same thing with Mithras. So it's interesting to me. And you have Franz Cumont saying, for instance, the Mithras expert, he thought that they were definitely connected, these two cults, that the Mithras, well, they performed a bull sacrifice, or a bull sacrifice is a major part of their mythology. And the Cybele worshippers, that was their major ritual, was cutting open a bull, and then they would douse their priest with the blood, and it would just rain down on them. So, people would say, modern historians might say, well, a Mithraeum isn't big enough to do a bull sacrifice. But Franz Cumont already addressed that over 100 years ago. He said that the Mithraeus used to hire the Cybele worshippers to kill their meat for them and to do their sacrifices for them. And then, that was just an extension of their ritual chamber, basically. And in a lot of ancient cities, when you look at the ruins, the Cybele temple and the Mithras temple were very close physically to each other. And in one case, in Ostia, in Rome or near Rome, they were right next to each other, back to back. So I think, the evidence is there. These two cults were related, and these two cults also happen to be anti-natural sex, I guess. People even like to depict Mithras as being, the Mithras cult as being kind of ascetic and, what do you call that stuff? They practiced abstinence. There's a C word for it.
Oh, celibate.
Celibate, thank you so much.
You got it.
They might have practiced celibacy or something. But when you look, the archaeology and some of the details of, what is known what contemporary authors wrote about them. They had members as young as 12, okay? You would basically go through what is described as torture in order to be inducted. And they were taking hallucinogenic drugs for these induction rituals.
Yeah.
The second degree was called the nymphos. That's the bride. And the bride is a boy. So you would be marrying a boy to a man during this ritual. Then when they're slaying the bull, historians might say, well, they never actually slayed the bull in the rituals. We don't know. There's depictions of the bull slaying, right, of Mithras doing it. And there's a depiction that involves someone sodomizing the bull. Okay, so I think that the Mithras cult wasn't asexual. I think it was definitely homosexual. And so I think that that's another thing that, it's been kind of cleaned up from, the way modern people like to view it. But I definitely think it was kind of a homosexual, anti-woman, pedophilic cult. And it was also, I think, I wouldn't say it's influenced by Gnosticism, but it had a similar idea because it was really all about getting out of creation and busting out and, creating your own world, which is, what I said before. If you would wonder, well, how can something like that go along with the Cybele worship, which is all about, it's a priesthood of castrated males? Well, it's just, again, all part of the idea of messing up the natural sexes somehow, I think. I think that Mithras's hatred of women is an extension of Cybele's hatred of men. And it would make sense if Mithras was her son, if Mithras was Attis somehow, or a recapitulated version of that, that he would have this memory of mother being the one who castrates people. So, that would go along with his hatred of women. I think that these things are all connected in very deep ways that are only obvious to people on the inside. Whereas on the outside, that's part of the reason, actually. It makes it easier for us to ignore it because it seems like all these doctrines are kind of in conflict. But really, they all have a similar origin. And it does tie into the mystery of Baphomet that I've been trying to figure out for my whole life here. That's a hermaphroditic figure, or that's what I've always described it as, and that's what people usually describe it as. But as I was writing this book, I sat down after reading all the Cybele stuff, and I looked at Baphomet one more time, and I realized, the Eliphas Levi depiction of him doesn't show him with a penis. It shows him with a rod instead, with a caduceus. And Eliphas Levi even describes it as such. He says in place of a phallus. And then there's a curved line going right over above the caduceus. And this is all in front of his crotch, right? The curved line, according to Eliphas Levi, when he's describing the meaning of his own picture, he says that represents the atmosphere. So
weird.
It's like it's the sky. Okay, so it's just like the myth of Uranus or Uranus, where he was, a hermaphroditic being with his bride Gaia, but then he got castrated and they got separated. So the pole is now separating the sky, holding it up separate from the earth, instead of there being a phallus. So yeah, I guess what I'm saying is I unfortunately came to this realization after I wrote a 600-page book about Baphomet. But I realize now that at least the Eliphas Levi version of Baphomet isn't a hermaphrodite so much as it's hermaphrodite that's been castrated. And, when you look at other versions of Baphomet, like the drawings that Hammer Purgstall has in his book from 1818 that influenced Eliphas Levi, those also have a hermaphroditic being, but it's really just maybe a woman, because it has kind of a vaginal slit, or I don't know, that kind of looks like it, but it has a beard too. But you don't see a penis, okay? And then that, what I'm calling a vaginal slit, well, there's no hair around it, and it could also just be a hole, like from where the penis used to be. So this is sort of my revised understanding of Baphomet. When I look back at him now, I realize, He's very much like Cybele. And in fact, Hammer Purgstall actually said that meat was Cybele. And another thing I discovered too, one of the church fathers, when he was describing the Gnostics, he said that they were essentially continuing the worship of Cybele, and they had similar rituals as the Cybelists. So, all this stuff started to come together in my head as I realized the Cybele worship was continued through the Gnostics, and then Cybele is Baphomet, and Hammer Purgstall and others are saying the Templars got into Ophite Gnosticism and that was their secret cult. Okay, so they were worshiping Cybele, and they're worshiping a castrated hermaphrodite. And then, just to wrap it all up here and put a bow on it, then I looked back at the famous pictures of the effigies of Templar knights, recessed into the floor of, for instance, the Temple Church in England, and then there's other places too where they have the same thing. So that you see his grave is underground, but then on the surface of the floor, on top of the grave, there's a effigy of a knight. And those effigies almost always show them with these crossed legs. Now, officially, they'll tell you that that's a sign of having gone to the Crusades, that a knight would be depicted that way on his gravestone if he had, done time actually on the battlefield during the Crusades. But, I can't help but look at that now and realize that that image of the knight with his legs crossed looks identical to the way that Attis is usually depicted with his legs crossed. And his legs are crossed quite specifically because he's just been castrated.
Wow. Boom. There it is. Gift wrapped and delivered. And it also seems like it kind of ties into that obelisk symbolism, that obelisk Osiris symbolism, all about the phallus.
The severed phallus. Yes, I just realized finally, it took me, I'm almost 39 years old now, but I just finally figured out all these, symbolic phalluses, they're disembodied for a reason. All these talismans of Priapus that people have written about. In the 1800s, there were several, writers who became obsessed with the idea that there was a cult of Priapus that used to reign all over Europe, and that this has been incorporated into Christian symbolism, and that this is what the Templars were actually doing too. And so they have all these, European votive statues and necklaces and stuff of just a penis, and sometimes the penis has a penis, or it has wings and legs and things like that. And I'm realizing now, yes, they're worshiping a phallus, but it's also a cut phallus, and there's a reason for that. It harkens back to this myth.
Mm-hmm. And in some of your blogs, you even mentioned that potentially that ritual, that tradition could have been dumbed down a little bit or nerfed a little bit and become the cutting of the middle finger, which is in those spirit cooking, artistic expressions, or whatever you want to call them. Also, John Podesta in that one picture, all his fingers are all screwed up. And you note that Johnny Depp, one of the strangest, most occult-aligned actors in Hollywood, he had a strange story where he cut off his own finger in a fight with his girlfriend, apparently. It's interesting to think that potentially this is the carrying on of that tradition in just a little more mild sense.
Yeah, I mean, when I published that article months and months ago, that part of it was just a tiny part of the article. It really sort of deserves its own article and YouTube video and everything, because this is a phenomenon that I'm sure, the Illuminati watchers of the world could really make something of. When I put it out in that one article, I got lots of emails from people saying, oh, I noticed this and that in, the stories of celebrities where they've accidentally, supposedly cut off one of their fingers or a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think that this ties into the castration idea. And also it is just a secret society rite that apparently, for instance, they do it in the mafia. We know. I found some old literature claiming that Freemasons would do it. This stuff was over 100 years old where they were writing about it. And then, yeah, I just ran into a bunch of other news stories where celebrities were doing this. But yeah, it's something that you do. For instance, if someone's a member of your secret society and they have messed up somehow, like if they had a mission and they messed up, or they broke their vow of secrecy a little bit, but you don't really want to kick them out and you don't really want to kill them, so you just punish them. And part of the reason why it's such a bad punishment is because if it's like a real occult, magic ritual type secret society, your hands are a very important part of doing those rituals. And there's so much power in your hands and your fingers. In particular, there's a hand signal that I kept coming across both in ancient stuff and in some of the modern secret societies, where they're using the first 3 fingers of your hands, so your thumb and your index finger and your middle finger. It's called manopantia, and there's a bunch of other terms for it. So it's like a hand signal that you can use when you're doing magic. You can like point it at the object that you're trying to bless or curse, or point it up at the air if you're trying to invoke something from the sky. And, there's probably a lot of different things you could do with it. But what I found interesting is that there's a lot of OTO pictures, I don't know, memes, things floating around you can find where it is definitely something put out by an OTO person, and it will have these 3 fingers. Sometimes you'll see the hand with the 3 fingers extended, just doing the hand signal, but quite often you'll see those fingers cut off.
Right.
They'll either show you the hand with the fingers cut off or the fingers just sitting there with no hands. And so I take this as a, sort of a reminder of a penalty. It's like dragging your finger across the throat. You're reminding the person of the oath they took, and that if they fail, they're going to lose their fingers, and they're the very important fingers that you need for blessing and cursing. So it's like if you get your fingers cut off, you've lost your magics a little bit, at least,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow. I think there could be a connection there. I mean, it's really hard to say. I mean, obviously they try to keep this stuff so hidden. You're kind of just stuck trying to connect the dots as you see them. And I think it's interesting. You also mentioned Superman earlier. And when it comes to the symbolism of the diamond-shaped Superman logo, in one of your blogs you write, the significance of the shape also has to do with alchemy, sacred geometry, the Masonic Royal Arch keystone, the gem cutters of Belgium, and the work of John Dee, who once lived at that very site of the Bloomberg building because of his obsession with the London Stone, another relic that plays an important role in the story of Genuflect. And that is a lot to unpack, but can you tell us any more about this nexus of interesting threads and the relation to Superman?
I can, yes. And a lot of this actually probably won't be fully developed until the sequel to the story, if I can manage to get it out here.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a lot going on there. The way I stumbled across this whole thing, is just that I was looking at the actual physical site, Bucklersbury, this place where Bloomberg's putting his real building. And I noticed that the site around it took the shape of the Superman diamond, the Superman logo. And that's what I called it for the longest time as I was writing about it and researching it, because I couldn't find a particular word just for that one thing. In fact, I couldn't even find proof that it pre-existed Superman for the longest time. So I just kind of went with that for a while. I incorporated it into my story. And as I did so and continued to try to tie it in with this and that element of the story, it really took form. It really did become something. So there's 2 things here. For one thing, I should just note, that the Rothschild building is right there next to the site that we're talking about. I actually have some scenes in the movie, or it's not a movie yet, in the novel, where they do the rituals at the Rothschild building. And I mentioned the name actual Rothschilds. I don't have any characters that are named after real Rothschilds, but I have the name of the family, and the location where they have their stuff. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting to me when I was trying to find connections between the Superman diamond and anything else in my story. One of the first things I did was just decide to put in Superman plus Rothschild in Google, and I came up with something right away, just blew me away, which is the fact that Lois Lane is named after a Rothschild, or she's a character based on a Rothschild.
Right.
But as far as I can tell, it's not that family of Rothschilds. It's some other Rothschild, and she used to be friends with, or she went to school with, the guy, Jerry Siegel, I think is his name, that drew Superman. So It's just some girl that he used to be in love with that he based Lois Lane on. It just somehow happens to be, her name happens to be Rothschild. And I happened to look that up, of all the things I could have looked up. So that's how I stumbled across that interesting aspect. Then there's the fact that Superman himself has always been considered a symbol of Jewish identity, hidden Jewish identity in Hollywood, which is something I learned in school. And, I recently looked it up online, and there's plenty of mainstream articles saying this. So it's something that's known. Now, the diamond having to do with the actual diamond itself, like a physical diamond, a rock, that part of it didn't come to me until, I would say, the last couple months that I was working on this. But it really exploded. It really became a huge part of, I realized it was a huge part of the whole story all along, and I didn't even know it. So it has to do with the fact that the shape that you see there of the Superman diamond, that is the side view of a particular cut of diamond called brilliant round cut. And this is the most perfect diamond that's ever been invented. It was invented in the 20s by this guy from Amsterdam, which Belgium happens to be like the center of the global diamond trade. And so this guy, Tolkowski, I think is his name, he was a mathematician, but he was from a family of diamond cutters and designers. So he invented this cut of diamond to be the most perfect stone for refracting light, so that it would refract and separate the colors out into the rainbow and make them sparkle and shine it the furthest possible. And it was just the most perfect way of doing it. So he invented this in the 20s. Around the same time, or I think it might have been just shortly before this happened, the biggest diamond in the world, raw uncut diamond, was found in Africa, and it now belongs to the royal family, and they've cut it up into hundreds of pieces. So this diamond, the perfect cut diamond, I'm trying to figure out how to say this without giving away the whole story, and also without taking up too much time.
Sure.
But the diamond thing, when it works itself into the story, it has to do with the idea of a Masonic keystone, right? You know about the Royal Arch keystone that they show in Masonic tracing boards. They always show, you have the two pillars of Yakin and Boaz, and then there'll be this thing in between them, whether it's the eye, the all-seeing eye, or a triangle, or an eye in a triangle, or sometimes they show it as like just an additional sun. Like usually you'll have the pillars, right? And then you'll have the sun over one pillar, the one on the left, and then the one on the right has a moon over it. And so in between you'll have this third object, and they're all called lights of the temple. So you've got the sun is a light, the moon is a light, and then this third thing, the eye, usually shown shining brighter than the others. So, you got to dig and dig to find out what does that mean. Oh, and then sometimes they'll show an arch in between the two pillars with what's called, the Masonic symbol of the special keystone in the middle. And so sometimes they'll put the all-seeing eye right on the keystone to show you that those two things are kind of the same thing. They represent the same thing. And then they'll put the G, they'll, in that same position in the middle, they'll put the G, which, nobody knows what it stands for. Does it stand for God, or, no one knows what? Well, so I kind of put all this stuff together. I can't even describe to you how, various ways. Anyway, the way I see it, the Royal Arch keystone, the Masonic symbol, is a plug in between our world and the one on top of it. And you can see this when you look at enough Masonic tracing boards where the symbol is shown. They actually show that. They show it being pulled up, and then the special light of that other object, that other sun, pours through the hole. Okay. And it connected with this idea that I came across. Well, it's a reality. There's a thing called a deck prism, which they rarely use anymore, but it used to be in the old days. They would put this on a ship, in the deck of the ship, so that you could get natural light from the outside, and the prism would kind of refract it and expand it, increase the light from the sun, or, the moon even. And that's a safer way of lighting the deck without having a candle or a lantern that might start a fire. Well, I thought of this keystone. What if this keystone is kind of like a diamond or something that can take light from outside of our world and bring it in here so that we can safely absorb it and be exposed to it, without getting hurt? Because, and I think this connects with, the reality, or at least what's said to be the reality, that we've got these layers of electromagnetism that we can't see, light that we can't see up above the earth. So it comes in through some of the layers sometimes. Most of it gets absorbed. We're protected from most of it. But, if we were to be exposed to it, then it would hurt us and might even kill us, right? But it's light. It's a form of light that we can't see. And of course, I know there's several different kinds, like there's X-rays, and then there's gamma rays, which, as far as I can tell, is the highest kind, or, fastest, highest frequency kind of light.
Mm-hmm.
And it's represented with a gamma, a Greek letter G, gamma ray. Well, so I thought, okay, is this connected to the fact that the Masons have the letter G there, right where the keystone goes, right where the all-seeing eye is always shown, and another sun that's brighter than the real sun, as they show in their illustrations. So, yeah, I'm thinking, is the keystone a thing that, it's like a window, but it's a kind of filtering mechanism also. So, it's bringing light in, and it may be letting someone from the outside see in, but it's still safe for both parties. It's keeping us apart safely, and perhaps also bringing stuff in. Like we were talking before about, what if there's energy leaking from one universe to another? Well,
Yeah.
This would be a way of getting light from another universe into here safely, filtering it so that it's safe. I mean, really, if you believe all this flat earth stuff and that we're in a made up world, the sun could be one of these. And the truth is, the more I looked at that idea, I just freaked myself out, because I found tons of stuff to corroborate that. So, we could do another show if you want to talk about what if the sun is an artificial crystal like thing, because I just found tons of evidence that might be what's going on. And, I don't want to marry myself to that idea, but dang, I found a lot of things to indicate that. So,
right. Well, obviously the symbolism goes deep, and that is a concept we've talked about before, not only with Crow talking about the idea that the moon is an artificial construct, but there have been guests who talk about the sun in that same way as well. It's a pretty epic possibility, but I think that Superman stuff is so interesting, especially that he's a representation of Jewish identity and hiding, Jewish elite hiding within certain industries. And it's funny because he uses the name Clark Kent, the most boring, vanilla, like American name. And the Rothschilds basically own the diamond industry, having started De Beers, who basically has a monopoly still. It's just like, makes sense that the diamond would be a symbol for them in way more ways than one. And I don't know. I like all that stuff. I think you're really onto something. Another thing I wanted to ask you about that kind of ties into this is the changing of the calendar, or the Gregorian calendar, or tying it to the Catholic faith, because I always thought the changing of the calendar to revolve around Catholicism was just a power move. And of course it is, but it might also be reflective of a new aeon, or that attempt at forcing one. Of course, it's tied to Jesus, and they say Jesus rules over this particular aeon, that symbolic character or archetype. And it's kind of interesting the way that might be thought of in more esoteric circles. Is that, I know you've written about it, is that kind of your contention as well?
Well, yeah, so I put it just basically as a throwaway line in the story, where the character realizes that, we're living in a solar age, that we may be living in the age of Apollo, and that's synonymous with Jesus in this way of looking at it. And then it occurred to me, okay, well, okay, so like in late Roman Empire, they started to amalgamate Mithras with Sol Invictus, and that's really how Mithraism became, the official state cult for a little while, and then it was supplanted by Christianity. These two things sort of coexisted, and they had a lot in common for a while, and then, Christianity won the day, and we all know really that's kind of part of what seemed to signal the end of Rome. So Rome got taken over by the solar cult. And that's if we even believe that, we're being given a correct chronology of history. So then, then you have, the age of the sun, the age of Jesus, and they just so coincidentally happen to reconfigure the reckoning of the years to give year one the date of the birthday of Jesus. And, I know that was all done after the fact. Like it wasn't, no one decided on year one to call it year one. But still, that's kind of their way of saying, oh, that was the beginning of something totally new. And, you can make something innocent of it. I'm not saying it's nefarious, but anyway, it's definitely a sign that we're in a new age, the same kind of classical new age that the Greeks would have thought of. And it's the age of the sun. And it also corresponds to some stuff that I read a couple years ago, and I've really not had time to make much of it yet. I don't know what to do with it all. But, okay, Anatoly Fomenko, the Russian guy who wrote 7 multi-thousand-page books about how he thinks history is fake. Familiar with that?
Yes, we've talked about that quite a bit with Sylvia Ivanoa and a couple of other researchers. I think that stuff's fascinating. I still am trying to maybe get him on, but I can only find one video of him even speaking English, and it isn't great. So I don't know if a 2-hour interview with him specifically would be the best, but his material is damn interesting, that all of history has basically just been a fabrication cooked up by Jesuit monks, and that maybe our timeline isn't as old as we think it is.
Right. Yeah, he had it condensed down to about 2,000 years. So, I mean, you could literally think of it as, here's just a way to think of it. Just what if, okay? It's kind of like Dark City, the Noah story of the flood, too. You wake up in a new world, that's, I think, what happened to Noah in a way. He went into a little box, and when he came out, he was in another world, but it was a still forming world. It was a world of chaos, and everything had been covered over with mud, and you couldn't see any remnants of the past there. And in the story Dark City, that's kind of the way they are. They wake up and they don't have any real evidence of what their past is. I kind of wonder if that happened to us, and maybe it took a few hundred years for anyone to come up with a fake chronology to make us feel better about, not knowing where we came from, make us feel like, oh, we have some kind of a past and a history. Because I don't know, I spent, what am I again? I'm 38 years old. I've been doing this since I was like 15, same kind of writing basically. And I've been trying to make head or tail of both history and mythology. On the one hand, you got history they were supposed to have some kind of basic chronology of it. But once you look into primary sources, as that Russian guy did amazingly, you find that the whole thing is based on just a few people and a few documents and an agreement that was made about those. And then every other piece of history gets hung on those hooks.
Yes.
And so the whole apparatus, the whole thing could be reordered. And there's no reason not to, and that's what he did, is he reordered it. He said, well, what if we put this here and this there? Aren't these the same stories, just with different names? And came up with only 2,000 years of history instead of 6,000. And then there's this other thing that he had as physical evidence for his theory, which I thought that was irrefutable. There's a gap in the records of lunar eclipses.
Right.
So this is a thing that's been supposedly predictable for thousands of years, and yet there's a time period in which it just didn't happen for some reason. And it's recorded as that not just that they forgot to write down the eclipse, but there's a break in the pattern there. And, I just thought about it as, well, what if that shows that, our order of the universe really was reordered recently. And so our idea of chronology is recent too. I mean, in the alchemical stories that I'm talking about, where they depict this conquering of the sun ritual, just graphically, they have graphics of suns and moons and what they're all doing to each other in rituals. And, you get the idea that you could really have a world, a universe born from the moon. Like the moon is kind of described as being this egg, that keeps getting impregnated and giving birth to new aeons. So the fact that there's a lunar eclipse that happens to be, the missing lunar eclipse is the evidence of history being messed up with. I don't know. To me, that just sort of sets something off. I think that this idea, the ancients had, especially, for instance, Aztecs, supposedly when there's a solar eclipse, the sun's actually dying. And you have to do a bunch of sacrifices to beg the powers to bring the sun back, because that could be the end of everything if the sun doesn't come back. Well, I wonder, if there's some sort of cosmic truth to that, especially if everything we're in a construct and we don't really understand how these things work, and what creates an eclipse isn't really what we think it is.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then if it isn't the shadow of the earth doing anything, then it might really be, for one thing, the death of the sun. It might really be, obviously, I guess, you don't see the full eclipse from every perspective on earth. So I can see the holes in my argument here, but it's like, what if this does signal some kind of existential threat? And what if the sun and the moon really are interacting with each other? They say that if Gaia and Saturn ever come together again, then that will be the end of everything. You have to keep them separated. And again, in these creation myths, they always or the alchemical creation myths, the creation is happening by sex between the sun and the moon.
Yeah.
So, if you got the sun and the moon joining each other in the sky, and then it disappears, the sun disappears or the moon disappears. I don't know. It just seems to me like you could interpret that as something literally happening between those two bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And then it might make something literally happen on our planet, or, on our world, that I think, you might not even know what's going on when it happens, right? It might be a bit like the Mandela effect, where you get transformed into a new dimension, but you don't feel it and you don't notice any differences, except maybe some of the more subtly aware people, some of the more sensitive people might notice a difference here or there. And then you get phenomenon like Mandela effect, where people are complaining about things that are different.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I think it might be. When one age passes into another, when your world has just been destroyed by one of the magicians and you've been made into a slave world and there's another world on top of you, that it's like a changing of the age and you just don't even notice it because everything seems normal to you. So the way I see it, you could even have the fight going on between, once again, heliocentrists versus people who think that the earth is in the center. Well, again, what if this is just an effect of us living in a solar age, that it seems like the sun is the king, and if we were in some other kind of age, maybe it would seem like something else, So the perspective on what revolves around what and what's inside of what gets changed when the age changes.
Right. Could be. Yeah, it's really hard to get your mind outside of a construct that is all-encompassing in your environment, but I like it as a mental exercise for sure. And some of the stuff you're talking about definitely makes you think there might be something to it. I find it all just super interesting. We definitely hit on most of the topics reserved for the deepest depths of the conspiracy pool. And those are the places I like to go, even if a lot of it does have to be speculation. You do bring a lot of context and symbolism to the table that has to make people think there's probably something to it. Is there anything else we should say to tie these things into a neater package, or can you tell us about where the research is going next? Are there more layers to all this that have yet to be revealed? It seems like parts of what you just described might be in there, huh?
Oh, I could go on for another 20 hours before I collapse, Greg, and tell you all about the deeper levels of the last book I wrote and the one that's about to come out. But just to add to the thing that I just said, tell me if I'm being stupid here, or if this seems like a valid observation to you. Okay, we just so happen to live in this world where we have this kind of yellow sun, but it distributes light that's kind of white, right? What we perceive as white light. And white light is, in our universe, the totality of all light. So it's just so convenient that we happen to have a source of light that will give us an accurate view of all the other colors, because, good thing it gives us white light, or else everything would look red or blue or something. And supposedly the other stars, depending on where they are in their life cycle, will take on one of those other colors.
Huh.
So, it's just amazing that we have just the perfect, it goes along with everything else. We're the perfect distance from the sun, supposedly, and we're moving at this just perfect rate, and we got the perfect tilt.
Right.
And everything's just perfect for there to be life, and quite comfortable life at that, here on Earth. And not only that, but now we can also get an accurate view of everything, or what we perceive as being accurate, because we've got white light everywhere. So it's really a good thing that we don't have blue light. Just what are the odds of that, I guess? And is it not then that our perception of reality is very much dictated by the kind of light that we're being bathed in all the time?
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean anything, Greg? Do you think so?
I mean, it's a little over my head, but I could definitely see it meaning something. And I definitely think there is a little something to the idea, like you mentioned, about the perfection of the construct, like all the ratios that relate between the sun, earth, and moon, the circumferences and the distances, that all these numbers are just perfectly aligned with Masonic numbers and Masonic symbolism. I've had Masons come on the show and describe it, and they're like, yeah, look, the grand architect, he makes everything using the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio and even the planets. And that's interesting, but you could flip that and be like, well, maybe this was all made up in the basements of some Masonic lodge centuries ago, and that none of it's real. So is it all a perfect construct, or are you just describing one that reflects the esoteric traditions of your order?
And they could be right too. Like, maybe the Masons are right. Okay, God is a Mason just like us, and he's using the same kind of rules.
Maybe.
But it is evidence of the artificiality of it. I mean, I wonder, how can you call something natural or artificial once you start getting into these things? Because, everything is artificed by God somehow, right?
That's true.
And I've heard people saying, scientists on TV saying, the fact that we have a constant speed of light, and that's the fastest thing, that's the limit of how fast something can be in our universe, is a sign that this is a programmed universe. That otherwise you would have just all these numbers would bleed out into infinity, as opposed to having, for instance, a quanta of things in subatomic particles, for instance. Why can they always be broken down into particles at all? I've heard people say that these are signs that we're in a video game.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about now is yet another sign. Yeah, we've got all these wonderful geometric shapes all around us. Well, yeah, maybe that's a sign that everything was very purposely designed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And was it God or some kind of alchemist? I don't know. I think it's impossible to really even make a difference between those two things once you start getting into this.
Absolutely. I think it makes a great analogy to a really popular game, Minecraft. I mean, Minecraft is a game where you build worlds based off a couple of specific tools, a couple building blocks, so to speak. And you could say the same thing about the Fibonacci sequence and the golden ratio and pi. Like, you're looking at the code of the universe. You're looking at the ones and zeros that make up the construct. I mean, it kind of indicates that there is a pattern.
Yeah. And then, okay, they say that there's no pink light, right? You heard this?
I mean, I guess, yeah, it's not in the rainbow.
Okay, yeah. So our brains are supposedly making this. This is what we fill in the stuff we can't see with, is just pink. So it's interesting because, like, again, there's different ways of showing the color spectrum, right?
Uh-huh.
Normally, for everyday purposes, they'll show it as a straight line. But when they're trying to tell you how there's no pink light, they bend it around into a color wheel, and they say, well, this part of the wheel is missing. This is where our eyes are filling in with pink, and we don't really know what's there or what color it is, I guess, what it should look like, but we have measurements of these different rays, and the ones we can't see, we're filling it in with pink. So interestingly, opposite of the pink spot on the wheel is green, which is, the color of the emerald tablet and the color of alchemy. In alchemy, they talk about there being a red stone and a green stone, that as you're transforming a substance alchemically trying to make the Philosopher's Stone, which is the highest thing, that it will morph into red and then green. And so I'm just thinking that, okay, a red stone and a green stone, either one of those are going to absorb, the opposite kind of light, right? So I guess my point is just, it seems like the emerald stone would be, I guess, blocking the pink light. Trying to figure this out, but it's like, I think it's tied somehow, that these stones, especially if it was acting as what I'm describing before as a deck prism, if a stone of that color were filtering light out from the outside, it would filter out the opposite kind. So anyway, the pink light, I'll make this observation again. I don't want to offend anyone, but I noticed that, okay, on a regular rainbow, you don't have pink, but on the gay flag rainbow, you do. And in fact, that is considered to be the symbol of the gayness, is the pink. And so, and originally you had the pink triangle as the I think it was specifically male homosexual associated. Maybe it's broadened since then. So I just think it's interesting, that to kind of make their statement, which I think the rainbow statement is like, we should all get together, we should all accept each other or something, right? They shove this other color in there that scientists say doesn't really exist. It's kind of an illusion. But then that's the representation of deviation from the norm. I don't know. So it means something, I guess, is what I'm saying. And then here's one more layer of meaning to it. You've got the 7 classical planets, but Meet or Cybele, the figure that was worshipped by the Templars, according to the artifacts that have been found, it looks like she was considered to be the 8th archon, and that she kind of swallowed up the other 7. Yeah, anyway, all these things link up together.
Yeah. Oh, man. I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, symbolically, it seems fairly sound. It's the one color that isn't in that rainbow spectrum, and it is conveniently the one used to represent that community. But the idea of us not seeing certain colors jogged something in my memory. I don't know if you saw this a few years ago, but apparently there's scientific evidence that humans didn't even see the color blue before modern times. And I pulled this weird thing up, but it says Kevin Loria breaks down the evidence behind the claim, which dates all the way back to the 1800s, when scholar William Gladstone, who later went on to become the Prime Minister of Great Britain, noticed that in the Odyssey, Homer describes the ocean as wine dark and other strange hues, but never uses the word blue. A few years later, Lazarus Ginger decided to follow up on this discovery and analyzed ancient Icelandic, Hindu, Chinese, Arabic, and Hebrew texts to find no mention of the word blue, which is odd. It is supposed to be the ocean and the sky. So I don't know.
Yes, go ahead.
No, it's just a very strange thing. I don't know what to really make of it.
Well, here's what I make of it. Well, maybe, in these eras when there was another sun, our perception of light was totally different.
Maybe.
And, another thing I found out researching alchemy is that a lot of the things they were known to have done and were even appreciated for was just creating different kinds of pigments that didn't widely exist. They knew different secrets of how to make interesting things, things that looked really cool. And so they would, I don't know, there's this one pigment of red that only the alchemists knew how to make. And, it was very expensive and hard to get during the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance period. So anyway, I wonder if part of the secrets of alchemy, they knew how to make colors and how to see with their special stones colors that other people couldn't see. And I can only imagine that there's got to be others that, potentially exist. So yeah, that's a very interesting thing you just said to me. It's evidence for so many things. One, that there used to be a different sun creating a different kind of light. Another, that, our perception of history and what reality was like for our ancestors could be totally wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah. When did they invent the word blue and the color blue? When did it first appear? I mean, I'd love to see that developed more, because there's got to be a lot more to it.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a strange claim, but it came out in a large amount of fairly mainstream publications, I mean, for the internet at least. And it was just a really strange thing that stuck out in my head. But man, this has been a great time. And I'm not surprised. We didn't even touch on the Clintons using their voodoo knowledge to curse Haiti twice with an earthquake and a hurricane and a tug of war they're having with voodoo priests, or Arthur C. Clarke allegedly picking up boys at the ping pong tables of the Otters Aquatic Club. But there's obviously a lot more meat on these bones, and we'll definitely have to do a future show about the flat earth and the symbolism around the sun being a false construct. That's interesting to me. But man, for the listeners, if they are interested in this sort of stuff, Genulect is a provocative, fictionalized story that does a great deal to flesh out what might be behind a lot of these things that we only have pieces of in the conspiracy world. And of course, your blog is great too. Let them know where to go if they want to get further into the stuff we talked about today.
Okay, so the center of Twyman world is tracytwyman.com, which I'm going to try to keep updated more and more. And then you can find all my books on Amazon. And, I've got a YouTube channel and some other stuff, but you can find all links to everything if you just go to tracytwyman.com. That's TracyTwyman.com.
Awesome. There it is. Again, Tracy, big thanks. Interesting as always. Keep doing what you do. And I'm sure we'll be doing this again.
Great. Thanks a lot, Greg.
You got it. Boom goes the dynamite. Tracy Twyman, people. Let her hear it. Straight.